Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology podcast. In this episode, we're going to be doing part 2 of our series on the significations of the 12 houses, and we're going to talk about the meaning of houses 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 in this episode. So joining me today is Austin Coppock and Kelly Surtees. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Hey.
Joining me once again in the studio. So part 1 on the houses we recorded yesterday, and we're going to release that in November. Then this is part 2, the follow-up that we're releasing sometime in December. And we spent a lot of time going through conceptual stuff related to the underlying premise of how the significations come about in the houses. And then we did a long, very painstaking run through the first 6 houses. Today, since we don't have to go through as much conceptual stuff, I think we'll spend obviously less time talking about that and more time just talking about what houses 7 through 12 mean.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any preliminary things that we should get out of the way or talk about before we jump into it?
I think we did that last time.
I think we can probably just go.
Okay.
And the 7th house, everybody wants to know about the 7th house.
Well, okay, one thing
thing.
that I think we'll end up doing anyway is that now that we've done the first 6, as we do the second set, the clear relationship of every house to its opposite house will be glaringly obvious to the point that it would be strange if we didn't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be, I think, part of our structure this time.
Yeah, there's more of a personal sense when you're talking about houses 1 through 6, and then suddenly you get to house 7 and you're more clearly and consistently talking about the other in some ways.
Yeah, or even the out in the world kind of sphere.
Sure.
There is a difference in orientation, if you like.
Like the public sphere.
Yeah, there's something about the out there nature, more public, more seen perhaps.
Yeah, and the relationship between the houses.
Yes, I think that is really critical. It adds to it.
Yeah, just as with the signs, part of the way you get to know the houses is by knowing what they relate to.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
What they're connected to, and then the ways in which they're different from that.
Yeah, and so I think that's most obvious with our first house of the day, which is the 7th, which is other people that are important in your life, and it's as opposed to the first house, which is you. So we have the you and the other.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me throw up a chart that has a diagram with all 12 houses and their significations. And I meant to mention this is one of the posters. We're actually putting this on a poster this year for the poster package where we include the transits for the year in both a circular chart as well as a secondary one that shows all the sign ingresses throughout the course of the year. And this is like the 3rd bonus poster we're using, and that's part of the reason we wanted to do this year, so people can have this on their wall as a reference as they're trying to memorize the significations of the houses. So these are all the significations, and then to zoom in on, let's see, we did houses 1 through 6 yesterday. There's the significations of those. And here is the houses in the second half of the wheel that we're going to be going through today, starting with house 7. So the 7th house in ancient astrology, the original name for this was the setting place, since that is, of course, both where the sun sets each day in the evening, once it hits the degree of the descendant, but also planets through their diurnal rotation, they also set each day on the western horizon, which is associated with the 7th house. The 7th is an angular house, and the primary significations that I have on our chart here associated with it is relationships, partnership, marriage, and the concept of the other as contrasted with the first house signification, which is the self. So first house is self, and 7th house is other. So back to what you were saying, Austin, that was your entry point into this, was you're saying that this is primarily the house of the other.
Mm-hmm. This is the most social house of the zodiac we've talked about, not of the zodiac, of the chart.
Right.
We've talked about how planets in a given chart are not always primarily going to show up as you. The unit of the chart is the life, not the self. The self is a subpart of the life, the part you identify with.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 7th, which opposes the first, we see planets showing up as people you encounter and have significant relationships with.
Yeah.
And that's one of my keywords for the 7th is significant relationship. And that certainly includes the romantic and marriage partnership types. But you'll also see people that you have very close friendships or even close business partnerships with. So we talked about the 3rd as a social place, but the 7th is much more social. It is the angular house that has strong social significations. And so you see a level of intimacy and entanglement in the 7th that you don't see in the 3rd.
Yeah. The intimacy factor, I think, because I say the same thing, that the 7th house can describe a very close friendship, and of course the business partnerships as well. But what defines a close friendship from not a close friendship, or from a close business partnership, is that level of intimate exchange. Not referring necessarily to anything physical intimacy, but it's more that emotional, the sort of knowingness that the other person has around who you are and what you're about and what you're dealing with.
And so one of the things that's funny about that is that also sometimes it creates, and there's a natural tension with the 7th house, because it's also, if you're looking at it and contrasting it with the rising sign, the 7th house represents often many opposing qualities that you don't have in the rising sign, especially in terms of the elemental polarity, where, for example, if you have, let's say just hypothetically, Aquarius rising, then Leo.
Just hypothetically.
Yeah,
hypothetical.
Just throwing out examples, hypothetical ones. So if you had Aquarius rising, then Aquarius is like a masculine air sign that is also a fixed sign. But then on the descendant, what you find is the opposite elementally. You find a fire sign. You find Leo, a fire sign, which at least in the Stoic qualities, fire signs tend to be hot and air signs tend to be cold or cooling. There's some debate about that in the tradition in terms of like hot versus cold and which signs are which. But let's just say, for the sake of argument at least, that Aquarius is very different than Leo.
Totally.
And so there's something about the 7th house, when you're looking at it from that perspective, that is automatically presenting a contrasting quality that's sort of absent in some ways or not present, while there's similarities, both of them being like fixed signs or both of them being, let's say, masculine signs, if you use that language. The elemental difference is introducing something new and something contrasting enough to be sometimes uncomfortable, but other times productive and useful.
Yeah, so I would agree with that, and I would say it's even easier to make that point with planetary rulers.
Right.
Yes,
right? Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, and Leo's ruled by the Sun.
Yeah.
You've got
massive
thin
polarity.
and grim on one side.
I don't know if that was the term, but okay.
That's what I said.
We're going to stick with that.
And then you have, sunny.
Warm and sunny
on
the
the
other
other.
side.
And Mars and Venus ruled signs opposed, and Mercury and Jupiter ruled signs opposed. And then Sun Saturn and Moon Saturn. So we always have strong polarity.
Yeah.
Right. So that idea of polarity, and sometimes that can be difficult, or it can indicate tensions. It can indicate that which feels uncomfortable to the native in some sense, because it's an opposite or almost antithetical quality from what they personally exude in some ways themselves, in terms of what's coming from their first house and their body and their mind. But other times it can also be a component that you're sort of missing and can sort of attract to yourself in a way that complements or completes and adds something that's actually useful or beneficial that you might not have had otherwise.
Yeah, it's almost astrology's way of saying that you're bound to encounter what you refuse to identify with, or that which you simply don't identify with.
Or that which you reject.
The opposite's just going to find you.
Yeah.
It is. And that might be there astronomically, in the sense that like the ascendant is that which was rising and emerging and coming into visibility at the moment of your birth, whereas the setting is something that's moving underneath the horizon and is being concealed and submerged in some sense, so that it's not always fully conscious in the individual, especially early on in their life, but it's something that they may come into their life or be added to it at some point.
Yeah. Well, and so the the horizontal dynamics are really important here, just as they are in the first, right? Because the first is the first and the seventh are the only two houses that in a whole sign system are partially above the horizon and partially below.
Right.
Yeah.
And in the first, we dealt with that as that union of the ghostly and the fleshy. And what is the other but another union of the ghostly and the fleshy, right? And that's who we're relating to.
Yeah.
And none of the other houses have that astronomical characteristic.
Yeah. And it's important that the ascendant or the rising sign, the astronomical motion is one of like emergence. Like that's where the sun emerges from underneath the horizon or where the planets rise up and emerge over the horizon. But at the descendant, we have the opposite motion astronomically where the sun is setting and submerging and like moving into the earth, or the other planets are setting and moving into and being submerged within, but also uniting with the earth in some way where the sky and the earth come together. And I think it's that notion of like coming together and union that ends up becoming one of the primary symbolic motifs of the seventh house and most of the significations then that come out of the seventh house.
Yeah. Well, and to further riff on that, a planet that is rising in the east is separating.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna.
It's separating from, and it is individually visible as separate from the Earth. Where a planet that is setting is coming back to that unification. If we think about the sun, right, the rising every day, the sun is separate from the earth as its own thing, and then it's coming back together with the earth, just like you were saying. So you have that union. You also, if just to use the sun as a model here, if we're talking about the individuating of consciousness or the understanding of self as separate than other.
Yes.
And then we have in the seventh, we have the other people exist, that coming back to union and compromise and, that, I'm not alone. I have to make.
How do I interact with another? If I'm not alone, I can't just do everything I want when I want.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, and what were you saying, Kelly? You were going to go.
Oh,
with
yeah.
that
Just riffing on that idea that you guys were talking about. The visual I got when you were talking about the sun setting is it becomes less clear where the distinctions of separation are. So that, if you're outside 2 hours before sunset, you can very clearly see the horizon line. But the longer you stay out there and the more the sun sets, the more it's like, is that the horizon? Because as it gets darker, so there is that sense of we have less separation here. And so therefore there is that idea, like just exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, like that. Like there's a visual
visual component, the blurring, like it's not clear where the lines are. And partnership is about clarifying where the lines are that perhaps you're both on one side of, but then the lines between you, do we want lines? Do we not want lines? Where do we want to put our lines?
Yeah, when the lines as it's a negotiation, it's inherently dynamic.
It's an evolving thing.
Just like a sunset, right?
They're here now and then they're over there.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very, there's a lot of symbolism in that idea of the union here, I think.
It's a really good point, Chris.
Yeah. And that's actually comes back to the issue that we mentioned earlier about there still being an issue of traditionally there's like 3 different houses at different points that have been associated with sex. But in the 2nd century, Valens, and I think some of the early Hellenistic astrologers had a tendency to sometimes put it in the 7th house because of that notion of union.
Yeah.
Of like coming together symbolically.
Well, you definitely... if we're talking about, if we're saying sex acts require 2 or more people, there are certainly some that can be done solitary.
Yeah.
But if we're using 2+ as our definition, or that's a meaningful subcategory of sex acts, then
Austin does like to be specific.
Right.
We noticed that in the first part. Yeah.
Then, you do need a 7th, you need something going on with the 7th house to get somebody else there.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that we can differentiate that between sexual pleasure, right? Because a person can pleasure themselves without needing anybody else.
Yes.
But if we're,
if we're talking about the context of physical intimacy with another person,
then you need somebody else.
Yeah.
Or something else.
So this opens up the broader category then of the main one that we find in the 7th house, which is just relationships.
Yeah.
And this is where astrologers look to in the chart for the topic of relationships, both in terms of what is the sign that is on the cusp of the seventh house and what is the quality of that sign, what planets are in the seventh house, and what are the quality of those planets that those are importing into the seventh house in terms of what that means for the types of relationships the person might have. And then also looking at the ruler of the seventh house for additional information about relationships in the life of the native in general.
Hugely important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So so romantic relationships is often the primary one that we're talking about there.
Yes. And
So-
that is the primary piece, I think.
And that's usually like longish term, let's say, relationships. Like it doesn't, while marriage will sort of get to that point, and that's certainly one of the primary relationships. If a person does get married at some point, the marriage partner, that's where you'll find them, is in the seventh house.
Yeah.
This can also mean just like a long-term, let's say a steady relationship would fall into the category of the seventh house.
Yeah, I think if there's some sort of known commitment, doesn't have to be a marriage ceremony per se, but if it's that idea of we are together, or we have defined this relationship, it doesn't, could be exclusive, not exclusive, but whatever agreement you make. But I think there is a longevity component, and probably something in the, how bound together are our lives in terms of, are we living together? Are we working together? Do we have children together? Some of those components would sort of clue you into the substantive nature of the relationship, which would make it a seventh house.
What did you said intertwining? What was the keyword you just used? Was that intertwining?
Yeah, some sort of, your lives are kind of bound together in some way.
That made me think, because the keyword that Valens uses, which is evidently like a euphemism for sex, but he says like intertwining in Greek, or which like the closest English equivalent is like intercourse.
Yeah.
Which literally means the same thing. It means like an intertwining.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I like you using that keyword because that's one of the important things that happens in a long-term relationship is it becomes an intertwining of your lives.
Absolutely.
On so many different levels.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that characterizes a relationship or a long-term relationship versus, let's say, a friendship or something, is that sort of intertwining and that merging of your lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
More? No? Okay.
There's a lot to say.
Yeah.
So planets that are placed in the seventh will, it's interesting because they do, I would say, triple duty. Because again, we're here at an angular house.
Yes.
So the
global impact.
Yeah, it's just going to do a lot of things.
Yeah.
One is that it's going to characterize a person's subjective taste for other people in relationships. And they may or may not be conscious of what they're attracted to, but it's there. On an external level, you're going to tend to be drawn into connection with people represented by planets in the seventh and ruling the seventh.
Yeah.
And then 3 planets in and ruling the seventh also have a lot to say about timing in a person's romantic life. So, for example, if you have Saturn in the seventh, especially, but also ruling it,
Yes.
then you know what, we can say probably 80% of the time, if there's a strong Saturn in the seventh, that person is going to couple off later than the person who has Venus in the seventh. Saturn, and so the planets comment on at least those 3 things.
Yeah.
So Saturn in the seventh can indicate, or one of the classical delineations is delays in relationships.
Mm-hmm. And, for people out there who are, 25 and looking woefully at their seventh, like if you've got Saturn there, it doesn't mean that that you don't get what you want. It does mean that you get it later.
Yeah.
And, what Saturn takes all day to cook, it's often
usually worth waiting for.
Yeah. So I have Saturn ruling my seventh. Kelly, you have Saturn in the seventh.
Yes.
We both met our marriage partners during our Saturn returns.
I thought that's what you were going to say, actually, is that, you could look to the Saturn cycle, whether it was the Saturn return or some other type of Saturn trigger, to activate that, given its connection to the seventh.
Yeah. And then I got married on the waxing square of Saturn to Saturn.
Yes.
which is also the maturity of Saturn in
Yes.
the Vedic system.
Yeah.
But it was all Saturn timed.
All Saturn.
That's
Yeah.
probably a good principle in general for all the houses, that wherever Saturn is located in the chart can sometimes indicate difficulties earlier in the life, or things that might be a little bit more difficult for the person in that area of the life, but eventually get better with age.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, you need
Absolutely, like a fine wine.
Yeah, and
You don't want to drink that too soon.
there are
Sure.
special circumstances that can interfere with Saturn fructifying later, but the baseline is that it's way better in your 40s than it is in your 20s.
Yep. And better again, I think, in your 50s or your 60s, like just progressively.
Yeah.
Yeah, improves. But so that's, I guess, Saturn in the 7th. But obviously, you could have any planet there or ruling the 7th, and the qualities of that planet will come in.
Mhm. Well, and
Yeah.
a simple way to do it is like, oh, if the person's got Mercury in the 7th, they're going to want somebody they can talk to.
Yes,
It's going to be really important.
So simple. An air sign ruling the 7th or Mercury in the 7th. You might say your love language is communication. I mean, there are other ways you.
So what? Let's see. So I have Capricorn in the 7th. My love language is responsibility.
Responsibility, hard work, restraint, maybe.
Restraints.
Not inaccurate.
Well, no, and it was just what it would indicate is you respect or perhaps are potentially drawn to a partner, like the theory would say, who is responsible, somebody who's got their shit together, for instance. Capricorn's 7th house would struggle with a partner who was a little more flaky or a little bit more creative or a little bit more disorganized, whereas other placements, like a Venus 7th house connection, would be, really into the creative partner or the artistic partner.
Yeah. Well, so the planet ruling or in the 7th will also describe sort of relationship style.
Totally.
So for me, with Saturn ruling the 7th, I was only ever interested in like, are we in a relationship?
Yeah.
Or
if we define
not?
this, yeah.
Like my few attempts at like dating or more like less defined structures, it was really uncomfortable for me. I didn't get it.
Yeah.
And so I was very like doing this or not doing this.
So it was a very clear distinction.
Right. Whereas if somebody has Mercury in the 7th, right, it's going to be a much more mobile, like
Sort of
that's
ambiguity.
a person who can probably date much more effectively than me.
Yes. Yeah.
Sure. Or one I've seen where a lot of the modern texts, where I still agree with this, it's a pretty good delineation that I see sometimes is like the sun in the 7th, and sometimes the person or people with heavy 7th house emphasis need a relationship or a partnership, and sometimes they find themselves through other people, or their sense of like self-identity sometimes does become more well-defined, where initially that doesn't go well at all, because they'll sometimes at the beginning of a relationship tend to completely subsume their own identity to the partner.
Yeah.
But then eventually in the long term, sometimes if it works out well, that comes around and eventually they find themselves again. And there's a give and take or a back and forth that happens with that.
Yeah, and that's, I would say, at least as true, if not more so, if you have ruler the 1st and the 7th.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, that's the other piece. But it is, and that's an accurate statement to make, is that a person might really define themselves through their partnership. And I've said to clients who have Lord 1 in the 7th or strong solar indications around the 7th, it's really important for you to focus on quality control where your partner and your relationship is concerned, because you're going to take a lot of your sense of self or self-worth from that part of your chart.
Yeah.
And therefore, you really don't want a dud.
Well, it's because sometimes that can work out well if it's a good relationship, but if it's not a good relationship,
that's where it becomes way more problematic.
Yeah.
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 Yeah,
So
well, and
it's a great topic.
The thing is,
it's a big topic.
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and it's one that clients and students always want to know about.
Right. Well, and this was the episode I did last month, I guess now, with Jessica Lanyado, partially about relationships, although this is like a subset of that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we could do a whole 3-hour episode just on the 7th house. So I guess we're like, how much more should we say?
What were you about to say, Austin?
I was going to go further down that particular rabbit hole, but I don't think that's useful. So let's talk about just the non-romantic parts of the 7th.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because the 7th,
there's one
the 7th is also just like it's the biggest people gateway in the chart.
Yep.
Like, I don't know, for example, if you have strong Jupiter there, you're probably going to meet teachers for whatever you want to learn very easily.
Yeah.
Because they're just Jupiter people, rolling through your 7th consistently.
Yeah.
And so, it's, I should say, the social significations of the 7th are focused to a laser point in significant partnership, but you also just meet a lot of people like that.
Yeah, benefits from other people. Jupiter in the 7th, let's say.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the other topics that I often am talking about with regards to the 7th house is the idea of someone who works in a practitioner-client style environment. So that one-on-one type relationship. So, when we sit down with a client, we're engaging in a 7th house style relationship with that client. So some of the other significations is like if Lord 7 is in the 10th, or Lord of the 10th, or Lord of the midheaven is in the 7th, that can indicate that a component of your work is in this 7th house type setting.
Yeah, it's going to be one-on-one.
One-on-one. So you could, whether you're a massage therapist or a naturopath or an astrologer, it would all fulfill the one-on-one category.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Or sometimes your marriage partner or long-term partner is somehow tied in with your career or your work.
That can also be, when there's 7-10 crossover.
Yeah, or you meet the partner at work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's where if people are like, what kind of setting would I go to try to potentially meet a romantic partner, is see what house Lord 7 is in.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure, definitely.
And that can be a help. But the one-on-one. So there is a bit of a work component that can come up in certain...
Yeah, when the 10th is involved.
When the 10th is involved, yeah.
And that principle goes for the rest of the houses.
Totally.
Right. So if you have the Lord of the 7th and the 9th, then you are much more likely to meet people that you're interested in when you're at church or on vacation.
Yes.
Yeah, like a religious partner or a partner from a foreign country or a partner that you met in a foreign country is a typical delineation of like 7th house, 9th house connections.
Totally. Yeah, or they could be in your country, but they're from the other country.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, or any other country. Yeah.
All right. One of the things that comes up with the 7th house that might bear mentioning here is the 7th house is one of those houses that has an aspect with the first house, but because it's an opposition and planets in the 7th house are automatically opposing the ascendant and other first house planets, it can sometimes create some tension there, especially if it's difficult planets, because it creates some tension with whatever your first house placements are, which can be your body or your mind. And typically in like the Hellenistic tradition, they tended to put enemies in the 6th house or the 12th house, but there was a bit of drift in the medieval tradition where they started putting enemies or ideas of combatants or like open enemies in the 7th house because of that opposition and that tension with the first house.
I would say that I would agree with basically enemies are 6-12.
Okay.
A malefic in the 7th is an enemy.
Sure. Yeah, it can be.
I don't think that the 7th can host enemies, but you have to have specific conditions. Whereas the 6th and 12th will always tell you about that which opposes you.
Yeah, because also sometimes things that are making hard aspects with the ascendant can indicate things that are causing like health problems for you or like bodily problems for you to whatever extent the ascendant or first house planets indicate your body and physical vitality.
Yeah.
And sometimes this is also true, just the other facet of this is looking at transits and transits through the 7th house. So those can often be important periods of timing for relationships, either for the starting or ending of relationships, or if you're in a long-term partnership, then it can be an important turning point or a pivotal time for relationships in some way.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I would say that that's especially true during the formation stages of a partnership, let's say first 5 years or whatever, when you've been together for, I don't know, a good, let's say one Venus synod, right? So 8 years,
8
right?
years, yeah.
A lot of times what I've seen is that the transits to the 7th just tell you about what's going on with that person's partner. And they may or may not have any impact on relational dynamics other than like, oh yeah, my sweetie's having a really rough time, or my partner just won the lottery. And that impacts things.
That's actually really true, that the 7th house transits can describe experiences or circumstances more directly affecting the partner,
Right.
So Saturn there can be like my partner's having a rough time at work, for instance, and Jupiter there is like my partner's got the raise or won the lotto.
Yeah. And what's funny about that sometimes is I've seen people get disappointed because they'll have like a very positive transit going through their 7th house that's hitting a natal planet and they're excited about that. But then nothing positive happens in their life, but their partner like gets a raise or something like that.
But this is like what we're to our point, which we've been sort of reiterating throughout episode 1 and a little bit today, is that the chart represents your life as a whole, and the 7th house is going to describe the significant people in it. And so triggers to the 7th is like triggers for them, not necessarily for you personally.
Yeah. And it's like sometimes that can have a ricochet effect on your life, but it doesn't always necessarily have to. Sometimes it can just be in their life.
Yeah.
Although certainly sometimes with like, let's say a super heavy difficult transit and like there is the death of a partner, obviously that's affecting the partner the most and that their life came to an end at that point. But
that's a big thing.
Obviously that also affects you in terms of your experience of going through that, of losing a partner. And just that duality sometimes when you start getting into these houses that deal with other people in your life, of it describing both sometimes an event in their life, but also sometimes it can affect or does affect you and how that affects you.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, if you're at the point where you're actually sharing a life with someone and you're like, you have plans together, then anything that significant that happens to them does affect your plans. It affects the person you're hanging out with every day if you live together.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where it's a very subtle distinction to be like, well, this happens to your partner. So the technical beginning point is that your partner experiences X, Y, or Z, but it will absolutely affect your time with them. I mean, if your partner gets really busy at work, your relationship is going to be different for that time or, going forward as a result of that.
Yeah. And so, from a technical perspective, if the rulers of the 1st and 7th are in strong aspect to each other, then you're more affected by your partner, your partner's more affected by you. If they're off doing separate things, then that's going to be less.
Yeah.
Right? And that'll be reflected in life.
In life in general. Yeah.
Sure. So to take that back out of the relationship realm, it can
we keep ending up back there.
Yeah,
sorry.
It's so easy. It's fine.
Easy to do, isn't it?
It's really the primary area that's relevant, but there are areas occasionally, like for example, contractual relationships or contractual agreements, or especially in electional astrology, if you're trying to elect a chart for signing an agreement with another party, then usually you're the 1st house, the person signing it, and then you have the other party, which is assigned to the 7th house typically.
The person that you're trying to do the deal with.
Yeah. So in that, even in other it comes up very frequently in electional astrology, like in like buying and selling relationships.
Yeah. The elections and horrors for any contest between two parties, it's 1-7.
Yes.
If you're
when you're doing sports type things, like who's going to win,
especially like boxing, where there are two people.
Two people. Yes, that's true.
Unless it's champ versus contender, which is 4-10, but if they're on relatively even footing, it's always 1-7.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So all sorts of partnerships and things like that, it comes up in. If you start a business with somebody where it's like you and a partner starting a business, sometimes that can show up in the 7th house. I mean, obviously, if it's a close friend, sometimes that gets murky in terms of you might see 11th house activations or other things like that. I'm trying to think of any other 7th house things we need to touch on as...
Well, there's death.
Sure. Yeah. So we start getting into the realm of death in this angular triad, especially. So we've got like illness with the 6th, and then the 7th is the setting place. And originally, in the original set of significations for the houses, death was assigned to the 7th.
Sure, that's where Maternus had it.
Yeah. Well, and that's in Vedic, that's standard.
They still assign it to the 7th.
Yeah. So,
but they also assign it to the 8th, don't they?
Yes. So very basic protocol is determining which planet has the greatest killing power.
Right.
The Maraka. And so it's either you look at the rulers of the 7th and 2nd and see who's more malefic and stronger. And then that'll be the planet that you're most concerned about when you're doing death timing. But the 7th is the primary one there.
Okay.
And that's actually because it's 12th from the 8th. 8th
Yeah.
The eighth is death, but also longevity, and that which destroys your longevity. Anyway.
But yeah, I mean, the symbolism of
seventh is used as an indicator for death.
Yes.
Sure.
But the symbolism of the setting sun was considered to be like the death of whether it was the sun or another planet that they're dying.
Like an Egyptian cosmology.
The euphemism for death is going into the Western lands.
Yes.
Okay.
Which is where the sun goes when it dies at night.
So in the early Western, the Hellenistic tradition, there was a tension for the first 1,000 years because there was one early text, like the first text on the houses put death in the seventh, and that was the Hermes text. And I talked about this on the previous episode on the house division issue and the debate about the origins of house division. So the Hermes text was probably the first text on the houses, and it put death in the seventh. But then there was this second text that was written later that revised some of the significations, and it moved death firmly to the eighth house. In the later tradition and authors like Antiochus and Thrasyllus and Vedius Valens, you see a tension where they have a tension between which to assign it to.
Yeah.
Because astrologers, even if they're capable sometimes of assigning topics to multiple houses, there's always this tendency to want to try to find one primary house to put it in.
Yeah.
And most of the later tradition ended up siding with the eighth house, and at least in the Western tradition, and putting death in the eighth for the most part.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sure. So we'll get into that more topic, obviously, more
Very
in the
shortly.
very next house. But it's important sometimes to realize that some of these houses have a connection with each other through the connection of the angular triad, and there being like a process that's taking place in terms of those three houses. So this one is the angular triad around the descendant, where we find, illness in the sixth, we find the setting place in the seventh, and then we find in most of the other tradition sort of death and inheritance and other things connected with death in the eighth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see too with the seventh, I can understand that it's sort of stuckness. The seventh sees the first, but it stands in opposition to it. So you could see with the first being life, that, what is in opposition to life.
Right.
But then, of course, the eighth doesn't aspect the ascendant. So, yeah, the symbolism.
And that issue of that which does not aspect the ascendant being antithetical to life versus whether the opposition itself from that sign is antithetical.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else we need to touch on in the seventh before we move forward to the next house?
I think it's a nice transition to the eighth.
Yeah, it sounds like we're already like jumping.
We're kind of like, apparently we are ready to go.
Yeah. All right, let's do it then. Let's throw up the chart. So here is our diagram again for the eighth house. So the eighth house traditionally in ancient Hellenistic astrology was called the inactive place or the idle place. It is said to signify death, inheritance, and the assets of others, or money or financial matters involving others. It is a succedent house. It's the succedent house that follows after the seventh house or the angular house, so that planets in the eighth are sort of rising up to and come into angularity after those in the seventh house. So those are our basic sort of significations and meanings. And the eighth house is one of those tricky houses because it's gone through a lot of transformations in modern times. Transformation as like a keyword, funny keyword for that house. But the eighth house is one of those houses that it's tough because when you go back and read a lot of the ancient Hellenistic texts, they don't have a ton to say about it aside from like death, inheritance. Valens does mention like the partner's money at one point as a derivative house signification, but they don't go into it a lot outside of that. But in modern times, the eighth house has become, in some astrological schools, like a major focus, partially due to the modern assignment of like equivocation of signs with the houses and then modern planets with the houses.
Yeah, Pluto rules the eighth house, right, Chris?
Well, that's what has come
That's in your book, isn't it?
Yeah, the Hellenistic astrology book.
That's Antiochus, right?
Right. Yeah, so it's like if you don't have that, if you're not assigning Scorpio to the eighth house or Pluto to the eighth house, then all you have to work with is some of what we've mentioned here, which is that it's a house that does not aspect the ascendant, so therefore it's thought to be not supportive of life, and that it's a succedent house that follows after the seventh house where the planet's set. And that seems to be why it starts to get these ideas of that which comes after life or that which comes after death or death itself, because it's coming after and has a sense of finality in completing the angular triad around the descendant.
Mm. There are other things that we could throw into the eighth house.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's throw some positive things into the eighth house.
How about debt?
Yeah, I mean, debt.
Well,
So one
Yes.
of the most practical, or one of the more practical sets of significations with the eighth is borrowing money or having money borrowed from you.
Yeah.
And we see this very strongly within the second eighth axis. The second is your stuff, the substance of the native. The eighth is sort of mine, yours, ours.
Yes.
And so, for a lot of people who deal with huge amounts of money, you often have big second eighth action because in order to do, big business, you have to borrow money to do this. Everything is funded, by loans, and there's a repayment schedule, et cetera, et cetera.
Let's explain why that is conceptually, because it introduces a new concept that we haven't introduced yet, which is once you get to the eighth house, you start getting into the concept of derived or derivative houses or turning the wheel. Because if the first house is you and the second house indicates your money or your finances, and the seventh house is the other or is your, let's say, your marriage partner, then by extension, the eighth house is the second house relative to the seventh house.
Others' money.
Yeah, so literally others' money or the assets of others. And when you introduce that as a concept of other people's money or that which belongs to others, that broadens it and creates a much broader category of things that you could start putting there.
Yeah.
And it's not only seventh from the second, it's second from the seventh. So you're getting that same thing on both sides. And so inheritance, right, is one of the oldest set of significations there. And that's not your money until it's your money, right?
And yes, until somebody dies.
Right.
Yeah.
You also see at least I'm not sure if it shows up at first in the Arabic phase or if we can find some late Hellenistic stuff, but it's been used for well over 1,000 years for judging dowry, right? Judging like how many goats will my partner bring to the marriage?
To the marriage.
That's very, very relevant these days.
But it is. Like people bring assets, people bring baggage of gold, silver, and
it is
gross
actually
relevant,
like not a dowry per se, but are you more inclined to marry someone who is more well off than you or less well off than you? Like there is a way of assessing, and I've done this with some clients, like the second house versus the eighth house. Do you have more money than your partner? Does your partner have more money than you?
And it works very consistently.
It's quite, and clients, it's quite a spectacularly simple but quite impressive thing to be able to do with a chart.
Yeah.
Because there can be like financial inequalities in relationships.
Hugely.
And this is where you can start to see that in a chart.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, and also even if, so the dowry is a thing we mostly don't do anymore. We don't do it in America, at least. It's in effect in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
Right. But even if you're like, we're two broke kids and we're getting married, 20 years down the line, one person may have ended up bringing a lot more substance financially to the marriage. Also, people inherit. Unless your parents have absolutely nothing, which happens.
Yes.
But a lot of people have parents that have something. And so again, it might not show up when you're two broke kids, but like in 30 years, one person inherits $1 million and one person inherits a set of stamps.
Right.
Yeah. I actually know somebody who was in a long-term marriage for actually his entire life for 40 or 50 years. And he had Jupiter in Pisces in the 8th house, and his wife at one point, her mother died and they inherited like $1 million mansion from her mother, which is just this like sudden financial windfall. And it sort of showed up in his chart through his 8th house, which was indicating the sudden rise coming from his partner's finances.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've had the opposite with a client where something very difficult, she was in I can't remember the specifics, but it was like Saturn was transiting a difficult planet in the 8th perhaps, and the partner was going through an incredibly stressful time with his business partner.
Right.
And that was causing huge financial stress on her, but it wasn't that she was in that idea of it was her partner's difficult situation. So, but I think all the money things in the 8th house, like taxes, how you're handling your tax debt, any kind of loans, inheritances are not always, I had this experience personally, they're not always the financial inheritance that you think about.
Oh, no, there's all the rest of the things that we inherit.
Yeah, and the experience I had was Jupiter was transiting my 8th, and my original astrology teacher became sick with cancer and did pass away in that time, which was very devastating for me on a personal level. Professionally, she was looking to hand over different elements of her practice to someone and ended up referring all of these clients to me quite early in my practice. So I sort of inherited not her entire business, but enough of kind of a leg up, if you like. So that just to say, inheritance isn't, I mean, it can be stamps as well.
Yeah, it can be a genetic disorder.
That's true.
If you
We
have
did talk
the
about
ruler
that.
of the 6th in the 8th, like good chance that your health problems are exactly one of your parents' health problems. You can inherit talents. You can inherit psychological complexes. You can inherit stamp collections.
Stamp collections. I will definitely inherit a stamp collection because my dad loves to collect stamps. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of other things that I've seen show up at the 8th house.
Yeah,
well, I would just say back to just money, like the 8th house is going into debt. If you've got the ruler of the 8th in a really good position, like for example, ruler of the 8th in the 2nd, by going into debt, you'll probably make money.
Yeah.
If you have the ruler of the 8th conjunct Saturn in the 12th, don't go into debt. You'll probably just end up paying interest on it. Or, just as a general, it's a general guide to, we could say, luck and how things will tend to turn out for going into debt. Some people make a lot of money by going into debt. Some people just get deeper into debt going into debt.
Yes, you want to assess whether debt is something for you to dance with or not.
And that's that comes up a lot more often than death. And death is absolutely something that we see through there. It's just that we generally will use a credit card more often than people die.
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, the financial aspect of the 8th house is definitely the most not negative one that you can talk about with relative consistency.
I mean, drowning in debt will be seen through
hugely negative.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying in terms of death, you can talk about it. It's hard sometimes to frame that in a positive way, but financial matters are definitely a major 8th house topic that's not necessarily always negative.
Yeah. You can strategize around that.
You can. It's more productive. On the death topic, there is other associations. Like you will see sometimes if you have Lord 8 in the 10th or Lord 10 in the 8th, people work in the hospice industry or respite care and things like that.
Right.
So
I had a funeral person that was like a mortician.
A mortician. Yeah. So the connections with death are not always explicitly you dying or you dealing, with the death of a loved one, but it can be being involved in the death or the grieving process in some capacity.
It was a really funny consultation because I felt like I was going out there and I was like, I don't know how this is relevant, but you have the ruler of the 8th and the 10th, and like a really literal delineation is maybe somehow your work involves issues surrounding mortality. Yeah. And they just smiled really bigly and they're like, I'm a mortician.
Yeah.
It was really funny.
Because there are morticians in the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's
we have to be able to see that in the chart.
Yeah, every possible, not just vocation, but permutation of different people's lives and how they're configured. There's so many of them, but they all are sort of in the chart. You can see it in the chart in different ways. And training yourself as an astrologer, what combination would result in this career or this focus in life or what have you is one of the major challenges you have to do as an astrologer to train yourself is just what is possible.
Totally. Yeah. Were you going to say something, Austin?
No.
Okay. The one other piece that I want to throw in for the 8th house, and I don't want us to get stuck here, but I do see this as relevant, is the connection to kind of disturbed psychology. And what I mean by that is whether it's some fears or some paranoias. I know in the modern they sort of say psyche and psychology, but I do see a little of people who are either suffering from some types of mental health stuff and or people who work in that field with strong 8th house significations.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys see that at all.
I think it can contribute. I strongly prefer the 12th for most of those.
I do too, actually. Like I do, but I think the 8 is like a secondary something on those topics.
Well, two things. One, if you have malefics in the 8th, then you're naturally in a position to deal with other people's malefic situations or feelings.
Yes.
I see that a lot in therapists. And then 2, within a natal chart, if you have, let's say, a life-giving planet, the ruler of the first, as an example, or the sun, in the 8th, then it is not configured by classical aspect to the first. You can't see it from the rising. And so, people who have sun in the 8th have a hard time being seen.
Yes.
Which creates which is a psychological challenge. It's hard to get the light to the surface so that other people can reflect it.
Yeah.
And so, one thing you'll see is that people generally don't identify with planets in the 8th. Because there's no configuration between the first and the 8th.
Yeah.
And that's especially glaring when it's the sun or the moon.
Yeah.
And so, the experience of that can be like being overlooked or not seen for what you're doing.
100%.
Or, you're one thing I've encountered a lot is people with a lot of 8th house stuff where they're contributing a lot to somebody else's well-being, or they're contributing to a group project, but then they don't get credit for that. And again, we're back to like debt, credit, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And that has a lot to do with the not being seen. And also because it's not just them. Like with the 8th, there's almost always other people involved. Like the 7th, it's a very othery place.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, very much othery.
And I would say, it's the invisible othery place, like, debts. If you ever loaned money or borrowed money from a friend, like, you kind of don't want to talk about that and not look about it. And like, they'll pay me back when they can.
Hopefully,
we want to preserve the dynamic, or, and a big thing that happens with any long-term relationship, friendship or otherwise, is people start like thinking about what they've done for the other person versus what the other person's done for them. And that's always like, below the threshold of 1-7 relation.
Like the underneath.
Right. Death or taxes is another one.
Yeah. Which is debt
Totally.
to the government.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and these are all forms of like shared or other people's money, basically. Like when we pay our taxes, I'm putting my money with your money, and we're going to do something like get the garbage picked up once a week or whatever we're
I like to think
contributing
of death in terms of the borrowing. Like we have borrowed a body.
Right.
Like we got to give it all back.
Oh,
like
that's
it's
a good
gonna
point.
come due.
Yeah. Yeah. We've got to pay this loan at some point.
Yeah. Like this is a rental.
Yeah.
And
That's
we
brilliant.
had mentioned this earlier at one point, maybe in the 2nd house, but accountants sometimes come up under the 8th house because you're like working with other people's money.
Absolutely.
Or
Stockbrokers,
bankers,
investment bankers. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Which is all the leveraging.
So to bring around with some of the modern significations, though, one, I was curious how you guys feel about this, but death, we're talking about it very literally here, but in what instances can the 8th be more like metaphorical death, which then leads to closer to the modern interpretation of the 8th, which has more, they try to take it more in the direction of like transformation. And while some of that comes from the equation, the attempt to equate the 8th house with Scorpio and with Pluto especially, is transformation a relevant 8th house signification, do you think?
Well, I would say that if you are carrying debt, that is a situation in need of transformation. And that is true on a financial level. In order to achieve financial health, right, you need to get on a payment schedule. If that is occurring in the context emotionally of a relationship, where like let's say you feel like the other person has been giving half of what you have, or vice versa, that is a situation in need of transformation, a dynamic that's in need of transformation if you're going to obtain relational health.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can extend that principle. Eighth house situations often need change in order to be sustainable or healthy.
Yeah, so there's a sense of there's a level of things maybe not being sustainable or functional potentially in their current state.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, by the very definition of debt, right? Where whether you've loaned the money or borrowed it, you're in an unequal situation.
Absolutely,
right?
There's a power dynamic that's created there.
Yeah, and so you get and that's great power dynamic, right?
Yeah.
Like the United States has used debt very effectively to control a variety of countries.
Yeah,
we're gonna do it. We're gonna give you a development loan.
Yes. Yeah. But I guess, so there's almost a very pedantic difference of what I think you guys are talking about. Because Chris, I think you're saying like, is the eighth house just a place of transformation?
Is it a place where other metaphorical deaths can take place?
Yeah. What I was just trying to say that all of these situations are actually in dire need of transformation. And transformation is, the problem with transformation is that it's a huge word.
Yeah.
Because that could mean anything. Like if I grew a pair of devil horns, that would be a transformation, right? But that's not, like it's too big a word. But like the situation needs to change to be brought to sustainable, healthy, equitable.
Yeah.
Very often in the eighth. Those situations show up a lot of the time in the eighth.
More consistently. Yeah.
And then metaphorical death.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think, Kelly? Or what other, because you were bringing in another signification that's more modern when you were talking about what again?
The psychology thing. And I know it's very easy to be like, this is a modern take for the eighth, but I think there are some kind of older allusions to this.
Yeah, like doesn't like the occult or something that's like hidden or something get thrown in the eighth occasionally? Is that true?
The occult is like, well, yeah, but it wasn't so much that. It's along the 12th house mental health, spiritual, like bad spirit piece, that there's a version of that seems to sit in the 8th house as well. And I wonder if it's because it's about things that are blind to the first.
Right, because it's the 8th house can't see the first house, or the first house can't see the 8th house.
The 8th house. So it's like there can be things that you're not aware of that can be causing you like unease inside, the psyche or the mind, if you like.
Right.
And so, I feel like we're going to probably end up fact checking this.
I'm going to pull out Valens and just see.
So while you're doing that, I'll speak to the occult.
Yes.
So again, too big a word, because there's a lot of different things practiced by, 100 different cultures, et cetera, et cetera. If you're looking at ritualized work, like highly ritualized, a lot of times you look at the 9th.
Yeah.
If what I see, because I've read for a lot of practitioners of a lot of different styles, with the 8th, I see a lot of people who are doing. I see a lot of people who are doing more mediumistic stuff.
Yeah.
Whenever I've read for people who are either professionally or part time or just really interested in mediumship, which primarily but not exclusively concerns the dead. It's always big 8th house stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's 8th. A lot of times it'll be like ruler of the 8th and the 7th, or there'll be multiple indicators, like 3 planets in the 8th with Pluto on the descendant.
Yeah.
But I don't see people who are, let's say, like, just to take, for example, astrological magic, where you have to be able to calculate the chart and construct the ceremony and do all that. That shows up in the 9th. That type of magic, occultism, whereas like more mediumistic stuff, spirit interaction, shows up very strongly in the 8th.
Yeah.
What is that category that a lot of people are talking about lately of like dealing with your ancestors or ancestral work?
Yeah, ancestral work.
Relevant there.
Yeah, that's going to be.
Or is that more of a 4th house thing?
I would say 4th, 8th.
Okay.
Like I said during the last episode, the 4th is like what's there ancestrally. The 8th is what concerns you about that. And so if those two houses are really tied together, then that's really important. But in most cultures historically, you did You honored your ancestors regardless of whether you were being haunted or not, right?
Right.
Which would be a way of activating the fourth and your roots. But if you've got specific stuff going on, like that shows up in the eighth, then that's going to be crucially important.
Yeah. So I just pulled out my book, Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, available in fine bookstores everywhere. And Vedius Valens in the 2nd century, he says the 8th house signifies death, benefits from death. It's the idle place, punishment, and weaknesses.
Oh, we should talk about the idle place. Because we've one of the things we've been doing with the houses is like, okay, just generally speaking, how much juice does a planet in that house have, right?
Yes.
And so the 8th is unanimously the worst of the succeedant houses.
Yeah, compared to like 2nd, 5th,
And
8th,
11th.
and 11th.
Yeah. And so the idle is planets in the 8th. If they have a big job, like ruling the 1st or ruling the 10th or whatever, a lot of times there's a lack of energy. And if you think about the time of day when the sun is in the 8th house, it's not quite sunset, but it's like the 2 hours leading up to sunset. And there's generally like I'm kind of tired of doing all of that. There's an energy lull during that part of the day.
That's true, actually.
It's like, I get off in an hour.
Yeah, it's like the last hour of the workday.
Yeah, it's the least productive hour of the workday.
Yeah.
And so there's like an energetic that's often present
dropping down. Yeah.
Right. And also, all right, what were you going to say, Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking up here. Yeah, the idea of the fear and anxiety that goes with the loss and the decay and the death. With eighth house.
Yeah.
And that's where you can get some of these
I would
psychological
say
components.
Fear of loss and grief.
Fear of loss, fear of grief, all of those components kind of go into the 8th, which I think is where we get some of that.
Yeah, I would agree.
Psychological territory.
Yeah, I would say 12th is stuff that's kind of just you. The 8th is those things which are relational.
Yes. Yeah.
I did want to say one of the things I just realized that you almost went into, Austin, was the 3rd or the 8th is traditionally, they tended to treat it as like the 3rd worst of the bad houses.
Yes.
Usually it's like the 12th is the worst because it both doesn't aspect the ascendant and it's a cadent house. And it only has a weak inferior sextile with the 10th or the midheaven.
Yeah.
The 6th is the next worst after that because it's also cadent, doesn't aspect the ascendant, but it is configured by a superior trine to the midheaven. So it's a little bit better than the 12th. And then we have the 8th as the next one in terms of the bad houses after that because it doesn't aspect the ascendant. It does have a superior sextile in the midheaven, and it's also a succeedant place. So that's sort of the breakdown also in terms of places, in terms of, and when we say good and bad, what we mean is like those that are subjectively more positive or negative for the native, and in terms of that which can help them directly or that which is helpful or supportive to them directly versus that which is not. There is a way, though, that 8th house placements can be more helpful or the more constructive side of the 8th house tends to come out. And I see that when planets in the 8th are configured, especially by a close sextile within 3 degrees to the degree of the midheaven, or to planets that are in the 10th whole sign house, that the planets in the 8th house can tend to work a little bit more productively in those instances than they might otherwise.
Absolutely. And here's an example for you of that. Maya Angelou's chart, who has a Taurus midheaven with Venus conjunct Mercury and Pisces in the 8th house.
Okay.
And by degree sextile to the MC. So someone who is known for her writing, her evocative work, her poetry. But her first sort of autobiography is called I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. And we've got the Venus Mercury is almost like the bird or the singing, but the caging component is the 8th house, if you like. So she's sort of speaking to, the cage feeling that, women of her color and her generation, had experienced, if you like. But we see that coming out in terms of professional success because of the link to the MC.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely. All right. So other things I want to mention before we wrap up the 8th house. One, I knew somebody that had a really well-placed 8th house with like Jupiter and a lot of fortune there in Pisces, although it was in a night chart, but he just had a way of manifesting like money from other people in this really bizarre manner.
Jupiter in the 8th, you said?
Also,
Yeah.
so that also rules the 11th, which is going to pull that in, which is very helpful.
5th.
Sorry, 5th.
Yeah.
Wrong square.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean, you are right. And I think there's also like a sextile with Venus that was supportive, and it wasn't afflicted by Saturn. So just especially through like donations, like people would just like donate money to this guy very regularly and very frequently for like many, many years. And he got by doing that. So it's something you can sometimes see with people that have favorable 8th house placements. Another thing is you guys mentioned at one point that idea of like, what is your love language? And you talked about Mercury and words if they have Mercury in the 7th.
Yeah.
But isn't like another one of them, I see with 8th house people sometimes, especially with benefics there, is like their love language can be like giving gifts.
Yes, that is one of the love languages.
That is one of them?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's gifts. I think it's just called gifts or gift. There's a special term. But yeah, there is a gift component.
Well, if that one exists as like a category, then I definitely would put that somewhere in the vicinity of like the 8th house, just in terms of like giving things to other people almost as a sign of affection some way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
The 8th house shows up in relationships. It's less important than the 7th, but I would never ignore planets in the 8th if I were focusing on relationship astrology for someone.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Did you think of any other miscellaneous 8th house significations that you wanted to throw in, Kelly?
No, I feel like we've covered all the ones that I would normally use.
Okay.
I'm hoping I'm not forgetting anything. Yeah.
Okay. Shall we move on?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. So here's the significations of the 9th house. And were we going to do this or were we going to pause?
No, we're going to...
After the 9th.
After this,
okay, got it.
Yeah.
All right, so here's the diagram. It shows the 9th house and its significations. Traditionally, in ancient Hellenistic astrology, the name of the 9th house was that it's the place of God, and that is opposite to the 3rd house, which is the place of the goddess. The sun is said to have its joy or to rejoice in the 9th house. The 9th is a cadent house, but it's configured to the rising sign through a superior trine. So despite being cadent, it's still treated as one of the good houses. Traditionally and in general, I think a pretty stable set of significations for the 9th house is travel, especially foreign or long distance travel. Foreign things like foreign people or foreign places. Education, especially higher education, and also religion or pretty much all matters connected with religion. So those are the significations that I have on the poster for the 9th house. What do you guys think? Any like core ones that I'm missing there, or ones, because sometimes like picking a single word is really hard. Yeah.
It's very stressful.
Especially when just one of those has like a few different like permutations that are all very important. Like I put foreign things, but usually you otherwise might put like foreigners or foreign places there, or foreign travel.
I think the key with a diagram like that is that each word is like it's a drop down arrow, like a drop down box kind of thing. Like if you think, okay, if we took God or religion, we could, go on each of those topics for a number of minutes, just expanding.
Divination and magic.
Divination and magic.
Are
So
both...
and astrology, but that comes in under the God wisdom piece. Yeah.
Well, I think it's worth stating explicitly. There are a lot of people who will talk about God for their entire life without ever mentioning astrology.
That's true.
And you see in Firmicus, there's a very clear planets in the 9th. It's like, oh, you're going to do this at the temple.
Yes.
You're going to be at Soothsayer. You'll foretell things by the stars. You make a great exorcist.
Yes.
It's all temple jobs.
Well, and that's like, so this is where when you come to understand the sun having its joy in the 9th, and then knowing that there are ideas around the sun being the source of wisdom or the source of kind of divinity, that the 9th house is like where that divine or reveal knowledge or wisdom kind of pours into your chart and your life. So the more you have going on around the 9th house, or the more significant planets in your chart that are connected to the 9th, the more temple type work you're going to do of some iteration or another.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think that's a hugely important thing. It's where like philosophy in the 9th comes from. It's the idea of the love of knowledge and the love of ideas and things like that.
Yeah. And let me read Valens' significations again from the 2nd century, just because it's illustrative, because it's so early. And while some of his significations are weird, or they're ones that didn't continue to be used in the tradition, there's some where seeing them go back that far, like almost 2,000 years now, is sometimes really helpful. But he says, 9th house, friendship, travel, benefits from foreign things. It's the place of God, king, sovereign, astrology, oracular decrees, the appearance of gods, divination, mystical or occult matters, fellowship. Oh, yeah, and that's the last signification, fellowship.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like some of those are a little odd from a more modern or a later traditional standpoint, but some of them seeing there, like travel, or Austin, you mentioned divination. It's interesting that he puts mystical or occult matters in the 9th.
I would love to know what the pre-translated words are, because occult is an English term that is very tied into that stuff being illegal and therefore you can't see it. That's a couple hundred years old.
Yeah.
I'd be curious what the
actual original Greek. Was it Greek?
Yeah, it's from Greek. I actually have like a long footnote.
And also other languages
obnoxiously long footnote.
Okay, I'll still read that in the break.
Other languages tend to have more better words than just like, oh, it's occult.
Yes.
I mean, it looks like it's in the footnote. It says mustikon apocryphon, so it means like hidden.
Okay.
That which is hidden, or that was.
So
which
it is
obscured,
explicitly about obscured.
Or occult.
Yeah.
Occult, because occultation astronomically is like when something moves in front of another thing and obscures it or hides it. But that's where we get the word occult from, because it's those matters that are hidden or secret, but also become sort of private or part of the mystery traditions.
Right. Well, okay, so that makes sense, right? What goes on in mystery school?
Yeah.
The first rule of what goes on in Mystery Club.
Although I do want to say that he also has some similar significations with the 4th house as one of the other like hidden places. So again,
it's a different kind of obscuration.
Yeah. The
darkness piece.
Well, so one thing
actually, let me give that really quickly. So 4th house, because I should have just been doing it all. It just would have taken a lot of time. But he says 4th house, reputation, father, children, one's own woman, and elder persons, action, one's city, home, property, dwellings, the results of actions, changes of place, dangers, death, confinement, and secret matters. So secret matters is the one that I was thinking of that he throws in there.
In the 4th.
But it's it's just a similar sort of variation in wording in the Greek.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
one thing I'd like to throw in for the 9th, because I think it's nice because it ties in several of the key significations, is the idea of the pilgrimage.
Oh, totally.
Okay.
Right, because a pilgrimage
1,000%.
is usually done to a temple, which is a 9th house location.
Yes.
That is far away for religious or spiritual reasons.
And it's special. It's not something you're going to do. If you did it once a year, that would be unusual.
Yeah.
It's like a one-off kind of once in a lifetime-y.
Right. And we were talking about 3rd versus 9th.
Yeah, the routine versus the special.
Right. Do you do something every new moon and full moon versus like, okay, every 5 years we do the pilgrimage.
Yeah. Yes. So I completely agree. And then a slightly maybe more modernized version of a direct pilgrimage is when people take these once in a lifetime holidays, whether you go to Machu Picchu and maybe you're going for spiritual, but it might just be that you've always wanted to take a cruise through the Norwegian fjords and you save up and that becomes this one big thing that you do one time in your life. That's a 9th housey type experience.
Yeah. And I would also, for language that contemporary people would probably be more comfortable with, than pilgrimage is like going on a journey. Or a quest.
Yeah, quest.
Right.
Yep.
But it's the travel with meaning.
That's the huge way of putting the 9th house together, I think, in its most uplifting sense.
Yeah, and if you're on the quest for truth, which is a very 9th house activity, you usually don't get to stay at home.
No, you cannot.
You usually have to find the person who knows something, or go and find the book, or
and then the book tells you to go somewhere else, and then you have to go. Yeah,
yeah.
the whole thing.
You don't get that that story of seeking what's really going on or the truth without movement.
No, and I think that's really key because, this gets into some big philosophical ideas, but about how our minds and our perspectives change when we go into environments that are different or unfamiliar to us. Because you can't think in a bigger, newer way if you're just looking at the same thing or talking to the same people every day. And that's the huge distinction between third house versus ninth house is.
Yeah.
And that's one of the main underlying archetypes or overarching archetypes of the ninth is just that which is foreign.
Yeah. Anything that's different, unfamiliar. Yeah. And then anything overseas, like international. Do people live overseas? Do you have are you going to live in a country not your own? Are you attracted to people? We talked about that with the 7th and 9th. It's anything. And then when you get 9th, 10th house crossover, you get people who do perhaps international business, for instance, or you get the academic
people
side.
People who are astrologers?
People who are astrologers,
like people who have the ruler of the 10th and the 9th?
Is that you?
Yeah.
I've got to think about that. Ruler of the 10th. Yeah. Oh, ruler of the 10th and the 9th is one of my favorite things. Yeah. But you could be an astrologer, but you could also be someone who worked in the academic teaching, publishing. There's a bunch of lovely crossovers there.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to go back conceptually to the reason why the ninth house indicates travel, because also partially explains why the third house does. And it has to do with the conceptualization of what a cadent house actually is and what's happening, what it symbolizes astronomically. So all of the angular, if you take a chart, like let's assume that this is a chart and it shows the 12 houses of the chart, all of the angular houses show planets that are present at the angles, and there's a sense with angular planets of fixity or of permanence, especially in terms of, in a temporal sense, it's like that which is present at the present moment in time, like the present, let's say. The 4 angles indicate the present.
The here and now.
And what's interesting about cadent planets, like let's say planets in the 4th house. So the 4th house and then the 3rd house is the cadent house that goes along with the 4th. So planets in the 3rd, they are moving away from or departing. They're traveling away from where they just were in the 4th.
Yeah.
So if the 4th house, being the lowest part of the chart that's under the earth, represents the home and the foundation, then the 3rd house, being a cadent house, is like leaving home. The planets are literally leaving home. And I think that's how you originally got some of the significations of like short distance travel being associated with the 3rd house.
Yeah, got to leave the house, got to run some errands.
Yeah.
Right. So contrast that with if the 4th house is home and is like you being in your own city, then the opposite to that is the 10th house. And so then the 10th house is a fixed angular house and indicating what is present. And then the 9th house is, again, cadent, and it's traveling away from there. It's moving away from the angle. And therefore the planets in the 9th are sort of like going out on a journey or setting out on a journey. But it's the opposite end or the other side of the coin from the 3rd house, where it's not a short distance journey that's just in your own local neighborhood. This is a long distance journey that's going abroad or going elsewhere and going into like unfamiliar or foreign lands in some sense.
Yeah, that's perfect.
It's beautiful. And I think the idea of like the sun and moon joys come in just a tiny bit there with the moon in the 3rd, is that we're going away from the 4th, but we're just doing it in a sort of a short or sort of repetitive kind of way, whereas the sun is more sustained. So if we're going away, we're going away. We're going maybe further away. We're going to be away for a longer period of time.
Right, because the moon just takes a month to do a complete circle through the zodiac, but the sun takes an entire year to go all the way around the zodiac, or all the way, let's say alternatively, all the way through the houses. By transit.
Yeah.
And so one way to think about that, so going away from the house is the 3rd. So going away from your profession is the 9th, right? You're like, oh, this is what I do for a living, but like, what's the meaning of life?
Yes.
Right? It's that kind of journey.
Yeah.
Right? And so that connects to one of the practical things that I find myself using the 9th for in consultations, which is 9th house stuff is about what direction a person's going in life. It's not exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because just as by diurnal motion, we're going from the 10th to the 9th, by the transit motion, we go from the 9th to the 10th.
Yeah.
And so with transits and perfections, you see people in the 9th house year figuring out what direction to head. Like, you know what? I feel really good about moving in this direction.
Yeah, this is
I think I want to do
inspiring
more
me.
writing next year.
Yeah.
And then when the transit moves or the perfection moves to the 10th, it's like, and now you're doing it.
Yeah.
But you like set the rationale, you set like, oh, what's meaningful? What's the wise thing to do?
Yeah.
And then you do it.
Yeah.
Totally. And you do in the 9th house triggers, whether it's perfection or a transit, there has to be a little bit of exploring. There has to be the sense of the questioning. And that can feel, to go back to your point, Chris, around the moving away cadency, can feel quite destabilizing to all of a sudden question things that you have either not thought about before or that you've previously held to be true, because that will kind of cause a little bit of shaking around the foundation.
Right.
Sure.
It's a Caden house.
Yeah.
It's a problem-solving house.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what's the right thing to do? What's the wise thing to do? What's the true? What's the meaning of things?
Yeah.
Like,
where am I going to get that sunlight?
in many ways, it's a more profitable problem to work on or to be tasked to work on than 6th house stuff.
Well,
You're
it's
like,
more
oh,
fulfilling.
Oh, I'm
for
sick.
Sure.
I got to figure this out. Versus like you get a positive if you solve the 9th, whereas you get back to neutral.
You get back to zero
if you solve the 6th.
Yeah.
And so the 9th is in I think every writer's work the most positive of the Caden houses.
Yes.
Yeah. And it also has this sense, talking about the motion you were mentioning, Austin, of planets transiting through, where by transit they have to go through the 9th before they get to the 10th. It has some sense of being preparatory or being a precursor. And I think this is part of it's preparatory or precursor for what you get in the 10th, which is ultimately your career. And I think this is partially where one of the major significations comes from with the 9th, which is education, and especially like higher education or college, to the extent of whatever the preparation or the educational preparation you need to do in order to get to what you want to then accomplish in the 10th.
Professionally. Yeah.
So on this note, I would add, or on this point, I would add that we grew up in a culture which sort of told us a mostly false story that what you're going to do for a living is going to be super meaningful. And if it's not super duper meaningful,
then you shouldn't do it, or it's wrong.
Then you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
So that's true for some lives and some people.
But not
for a lot
everyone.
of people, like that deeper meaning on a religious or philosophical level comes from activities that aren't work.
Yes.
If you have the rulers of the 10th and 9th entangled, then you should follow that advice. Like, you're not going to be happy unless those two are intimately connected.
Yeah.
If they have nothing to do with each other, then like
two separate
your
things.
spiritual stuff and your work stuff are going to be different. And that's okay.
That's okay. Yeah, that's something I often will have a conversation with clients around is, this is what it looks like you're doing with work, but this is perhaps where the meaning comes from, and the two are not always the same.
Yeah. And even if they are entangled, you still have... It's okay for them to be different.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then you mentioned education, Chris, and I think the educational environment, whether it is you doing a period of study, if it's triggered by a timing factor, but if we're looking at the natal context, it may be someone who becomes a teacher in a school or a university, or is in publishing, or could be in training and development and facilitation, something where you're looking to kind of bring in that. I think of the 9th house as such a solar house, from the lighting people up with ideas or wisdom, and you being in that environment in some capacity.
Yeah. Education, university professors, people that teach for a living.
Yeah.
People that are like gurus or philosophical,
like
spiritual
thought
teachers.
Leaders kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yep. Public intellectuals.
People who've got that high profile.
And so truth is really a key thing here.
It
right?
is.
'Cause all of those people are supposed to be good at some kind of truth.
Yeah.
Truth in the quest for meaning, and like what is the reason we're all here, and broader questions in general, or overarching like life questions like that.
Yeah.
But even an economics professor is supposed to be able to teach you things that are true about economics.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just the intro.
That's true.
Like, you're like diving through the reams of statistical stuff and the different models in search of truth.
Yes.
And even if, so even for those that aren't connected with meaning, which is a very important core signification of the ninth, it's still truth.
Yes.
And truth is in and of itself meaningful, even if it's just the truth of how an industry works. It's still like the quest for truth.
Absolutely.
And these are the people, the teachers are the people who've done the quest for truth successfully. Hopefully. That's what they're supposed to be.
In theory, yes.
Right. And remember just one thing.
Keep going.
The university system literally grew out of religious institutions.
Yes.
It's basically, they're mutated monasteries.
Yeah. Which is beautiful.
And so, and just, in Firmicus, for example, ninth house is just stuff you do at the temple.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Whether you work there or.
Yeah. It's the setting of the temple space.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so religion, those who are religious and all things religious are often connected with the ninth house. One of the things that I always find funny, though, in connection with that is that doesn't just include those who are quote unquote religious, but sometimes there are placements where you can see those who are opposed to religion, like atheism showing up in the ninth house, or people that are heavily involved in skepticism. Like there's like a couple of major like astrology skeptics. It's really funny that I know that have like Saturn and a night chart in the ninth house, and have like dedicated themselves to like, proving that astrology is false, which I always think is really funny because it's like the astrology itself is showing that they would.
Oh,
they
so
would do that.
You hate divination. You have an out of sex Saturn in the ninth.
In the ninth. Yeah.
Yeah. The people who favor a rational religion, it's Mercury in the ninth, right?
Well, that's
people who who connect to other things through the aesthetic, like that's Venus there.
Yes.
Et cetera. North Node or Rahu in the ninth is in Vedic, like the classic sign, or is the classic indicator for somebody who is very doubtful, skeptical, hates being in fucking church. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me what's meaningful.
Yeah.
Sure. And I want to say, and I want to be quick to say, like, I'm not passing like a value judgment on that. You don't necessarily have to pass value judgment on any of that, but it's just that placements in the ninth house can show somebody's orientation towards things like belief or religion or even science or things like that, and sometimes a posture that they'll tend to adopt towards those things or gravitate towards in one context or another.
Absolutely. So I have Sun and Mars in the ninth. So Sun's kind of natural there, but Mars is like, I'm interested in, mystical or religious things that can do something.
Yes.
I'm like, yeah, but so there are all these ideas about astrology, but does it work?
Yes.
And I feel the same way. My interest in magic is the same.
Yes.
It's like these are hypotheses about the truth of the way that reality operates. Well, how do they work?
Yeah.
Right. And that very classical Mars.
And another funny one is sometimes your interest in like martial arts or things that also like are athletic activities, but also have some overarching like philosophical or metaphysical basis as
An
well.
attempt to elevate punching people in the face to a temple activity.
To make it mystical.
Right. And the sort of natural placement of that is certain martial traditions were cultivated in monasteries.
Yes.
Right. And so I've studied several of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts that sparks for you, Kelly, in terms of ninth house?
No, we talked about the
activities?
education and teaching. We talked about travel. And again, the travel can show up in a variety of ways. Because some people will be like, well, I don't like to travel. And then they tell you that they're on their third degree or something. I'm like, so we're doing mental travel rather than physical travel here.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a thing too.
Yeah, like the 3 PhDs, the eternal student type person.
Yeah.
Or the person that maybe grows up in a heavy religious context or finds religion at some point in their life. Let's say they have a major transit through the ninth house and all of a sudden they go through a religious conversion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A classic is Uranus transiting the ninth. People almost, if it aspects the ruler of the ninth, or if it hits a planet that's in the ninth, the person almost always has a worldview shift.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think these are all what you believe in, the types of things that you're interested in from a religious type perspective, and then how you go about honoring that system or whatever it is that you happen to be oriented towards. Yeah.
Sure.
It's one of my favorite houses.
It's very like, what do you think is true? And then what
Yeah.
do you do based on what you think is true?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, or we can go classic philosophy. What is your method for ascertaining the truth? What is then true according to that method? And then based on what's true, what do you do about that? Right? Epistemology, metaphysics, and then ethics.
Yeah. And even though we did this at the beginning, I just want to touch on it again really quickly because that's often one of the most literal ways we're talking about, like broader meaning and metaphorical ways that ideas of belief and religion and what you think manifest. But often one of the most literal forms of ninth house thing is just somebody that is from a foreign country or something that is foreign or a foreign culture to you.
Yeah.
And different exposures or interactions with that in your life and how sometimes that can give you a different perspective on things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But in very literal ways. So that sometimes manifests like ruler of the 4th and the 9th, going to live abroad.
Yeah.
Ruler. I had one example I think I used in my book, which is like they had ruler of the 5th and the 9th. And one of their kids, as soon as he turned 18, he had a fascination with like this foreign country, and he moved there immediately and has lived the rest of his adult life
Moved
there.
away. Yeah.
Although it's funny because then her other kid grew up in a largely non-religious household, but as soon as she grew up, she ended up getting interested in this specific religious denomination and then like moved across the country and converted to it and then lives in a religious community.
Oh, that's funny.
That's so interesting. So we've got either side, if you like, different aspects of the 9th coming through with both children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's, many things we can learn from that in terms of the different multivalent ways that each of the houses have these multivalent meanings, different manifestations that can manifest at different points in the native's life or in different ways. It doesn't always have to go one way or another. I mean, there's lots of things.
Yeah.
What else? We've talked about ruler of the 7th and the 9th, like sometimes getting married to a partner who's from a foreign country or in a foreign country, or a partner who's into 9th house activities.
Yeah.
I know one example I use of they had the ruler of, I think the 9th and the 7th, or the 7th and the 9th, and it was their partner who got them into astrology and like imported astrology into their life.
Oh, fantastic.
And then as a result of that, the native ended up finding his life's work was connected with astrology, but he never would have gotten into it if his partner hadn't first for like a decade before he did.
Yeah,
perfect.
Brought that
I
through.
think Firmicus says that with Venus in the 9th, a man will marry the daughter of a high priest of a temple.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, we're still getting the temple here.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
right. Like if you are interested in marrying women, that's the preacher's daughter configuration.
Yes, the preacher's daughter. That's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, one 9th house example on the work front that comes to mind is Barbara Walters, who has a Cancer MC with the moon in the 9th in Gemini with Jupiter. And so she does 9th house type things of a Gemini nature for her career because she was a broadcaster and a journalist. But she did that, she had a worldwide profile. She didn't just do it. She wasn't a broadcaster on the local news and stayed there. We had the kind of global reach, which you can get.
Right.
Yeah, with the 9th as well.
And I would say that as like a secondary or tertiary thing, 9th house is generally good for, it's very visible and that it can contribute to reputation and visibility.
Yeah. Yes.
Like in terms of like how prominent is this person? What are they known for?
Yeah,
it
how are
would
they
be something
seen?
I would consider after a couple other things, but I would consider it.
It would be on the list.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think one of you mentioned this in passing, but publishing is a
Yes.
modern signification with the 9th house, but I
Yeah.
think that is one that works out. I think I was in a 9th house perfection year when I finally published my book after 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say publishing more singular works, like regular publishing, like a
Period.
horoscope column,
Yeah, with the
is
periodicals
going
for
to
the
be,
third.
you're going to tend to find that more in the 3rd.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah,
or
with the
like,
one-off book type thing.
mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other major significations of the 9th house that we've completely forgotten or spaced out before we move on to the 10th?
I
Well,
think
magic.
you mentioned it, though,
Yeah,
didn't you?
magic
Yeah.
is, temple science.
Temple, yeah, and
Let's call it
astrology.
temple
Yeah.
science.
Temple science. I like temple science. That sounds good. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Maybe that's good.
I think so.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, so let's transition into talking about the next house, which is the 10th house. So the 10th house is known as the midheaven. That's just generally the name that is always, or that's the name that it was called in Hellenistic astrology. Technically, there's a little difference there because sometimes in modern astrology, it's only the degree of the MC or the meridian that's called the midheaven. But in Hellenistic astrology, they had a tendency to call the entire 10th house the midheaven. In terms of significations, the 10th is an angular house. It's one of the most powerful angular houses between the 1st and the 10th. In terms of significations, it signifies career, actions, reputation, and the native's public life, as opposed to the 4th house, which is more about their private life. So the 10th is the most public part of the chart, and so we tend to get most of the sort of themes surrounding being in public and visibility when it comes to this house. All right, so where should we start with the 10th house?
Well, the thing that comes up most often is profession.
Right, career, profession, or career occupation.
Yeah, and I like occupation in that it's what you're occupied with. It's what you're doing in the world.
Yeah,
and sometimes that looks like a profession, and sometimes it looks like other things. But it's still the question of like, what are you doing in the context of the world?
Yeah, I like that you said that, what you're doing, because in Greek, the term they use over and over again is praxis for the 10th house, which just means action.
Yeah.
But it can also mean more broadly what you do. And when they use praxis in the 10th house context, they tend to mean occupation, like what you occupy your time doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Does it have the quality of enactment?
Yeah.
Right, which suggests that there's something to be enacted when praxis is used in like a philosophical context. It's usually putting an idea into action. And I do think that correlates nicely with the often intentional character of 10th house activity. It's not just doing the dishes because you have to. It's action in the physical world, but it's usually because it's very often because you're trying to do a thing, right?
Yeah, you're trying to achieve something or get to somewhere.
Right, like a profession is an intentional thing.
Achievement. I like that keyword, Kelly. That's a really good keyword for the 10th house, the idea of that which you achieve.
Yeah, there is a real sense of, and I like I always say I want to say praxis.
Praxis, yeah.
Praxis, yeah.
I have no idea. I shouldn't be cracking English pronunciation.
I'm not really sure. But it's that energy of acting out in the world. I like that word enactment, actually. Yeah. But it's very deliberate. You're right.
Yeah, I was thinking of Praxidike, which is the deity associated with one of the decans. And Praxidike, so Dike is justice. Praxidike is the enactment of justice. And so that's the goddess of passing the sentence, right? Which can be execution or whatever. But the praxis, like it's the enactment.
The enactment of it, yeah.
Right, because we're doing stuff in the 10th, but it's we're enacting something. It's not in terms of the houses and just the general topic in astrology of, is this something you just kind of have to do, or is it something that you've chosen to do or is in accord with what you're trying to do? The 10th very often is, there's more intentionality there. It's not always 100% intentional, but there's more intentionality there. Somebody who's building a career or a body of work or whatever, we see that in the 10th more than any other house.
Yeah, and there is a sense of you're making choices. You may not necessarily be doing work that is your love or your passion or your dream, but you do go to an interview or you choose to accept the job. There is a real sense of engagement with that process. So I think that speaks to the level of it's deliberate, if you like. But it's very much about work. It's about profession. How are you kind of known in the public sphere, basically, by what titles or what industry, are you associated with, essentially?
Right, your reputation.
Role and rank.
Role, rank, reputation, all 10th house.
Yeah, so we talked about earlier about how the second house, or the first house can be about your appearance and your character and how you come off to people in person. But sometimes if you're not meeting somebody in person, what you're seeing sometimes is their 10th house in terms of their public reputation. And just astronomically, we should touch base really briefly on what the 10th house is when we're looking at it from an astronomical standpoint, because that keyword of midheaven, we've got dual meanings of being sort of in the middle of the sky and therefore being very visible as a result of that. And ideas that like the sun or the planets, if they're right in the middle of the sky or at their most prominent or their most visible, And so similarly, the native, this is the part of the chart where they're at their most prominent or most visible. When you're talking about the quadrant midheaven or the meridian midheaven, this is also the point where planets reach their highest elevation. So sort of like reaching another keyword is like the acme of something, like the highest point or
The
highest
highest point. Yeah, the peak.
Yeah,
Right,
the
and
peak, right.
the highest is the most visible.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, the visibility is really key here with the symbolism of the sun or the planets being at their peak. And yeah, that idea of being seen, that what happens in and around the 10th house is not secret, it's not hidden, it's not unknown. It is very obvious and very public.
Yeah. And there's also notions of like with whole sign houses, for example, the 10th whole sign house is the culminating sign that has the superior square over the ascendant. And so sometimes you can get ideas of like superiority or superiors or people that are above you or outrank you in some sense, as well as what is your own rank in society.
Well, in your own rank or position, I think position and role might be a more modern way of thinking about it, puts demands on you where you have to do this because it's your station or it's your job. If we kind of go back to a feudal model, like if you're a duchess or a duke, you have certain responsibilities that it doesn't matter whether you like it or not. Like that's your role.
That's your role.
Right. And that's the 10th dominating the first.
Yeah.
Right.
And I do think that there's inherent tension between the 10th and the first house just by the square relationship between the two. So there can be that sense of being at odds within yourself between who you are and what is required of the work that you have to do in the world. So I think that's an interesting piece
Definitely.
to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and that's not something, I mean, I guess it came up a little bit when we talked about the 7th house, but we haven't touched on that a lot, or we haven't repeated a lot, but just that notion of like what is the aspect or the configuration that the house has with the rising sign and sometimes dictating, especially in a whole sign house context, like part of the reason why we're drawing certain conclusions about certain houses and what their meaning is relative to the native.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And to add to that, if you have really good things happen in the 10th, for example, someone can be rewarded and honored significantly, even if they're kind of a shithead.
Yes.
And so, benefics or useful configurations that are in the 10th are very powerful.
Yes.
And a person can rise to a high station even if their character isn't very good or they're just not very healthy or, any of the negative. You can have not very good first house significations, but if the 10th is strong, honored and elevated regardless.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that brings up a really good point that is something I see echoed both in modern especially, but also in ancient astrology, that hard aspects are not always bad, but they're always powerful. That hard aspects are powerful and they can be very powerful for good or powerful for bad. And it partially depends on what planets specifically are involved. But that becomes relevant when we're talking about the angular houses of, 4, 7, and 10, because they share those hard aspects with the rising sign or the ascendant of the square or the opposition.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but I do also like the rewards and honors or recognition, because I think particularly when the 10th house is activated for timing purposes and, more with, Sun, Jupiter type stuff, but we get those indications of honors or glory or success, whether it's promotion or acknowledgement of some kind.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, achievement is a really good word.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a good one because like if you look at the diagram and think of the planets where in the diurnal rotation they start out in the first in the rising sign, but then they rise and they sort of climb their way upwards. They're really climbing slowly upwards, first through the 12th, then they get to the 11th, and then eventually at the 10th you reach the sort of high point before the circle pivots and turns and they begin declining down through the 9th and then the 8th and then the 7th. So this idea of achievement being the climb upwards that you eventually get to the highest point of what you set out to achieve or whatever you had your sights set on that you eventually get to ideally.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important because that goes into that sense of achievement, and the peak is that you aspire to go up somewhere.
Right.
Yeah. And we have, more or less ability to do that depending on the signs and the planets connected with the 10th house.
Sure.
Yeah. And so, on a very simple level, a planet that is placed in the 10th will be very visible in a person's professional life once they have a professional life.
Yeah.
Right.
You may not see it when they're 12, but you might already be able to see it. But, once you see a person in their 30s or whatever, you're like, oh, yeah, you do that for a living.
Mhm.
Like, I have Mercury in the 10th house.
Yes.
I do a couple of things now, but most of them involve talking. And then I would say I built a lot of my career by writing,
Yes.
which is also very mercurial.
All very Mercury.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to keep in mind of the 10th is like, how does the person go about achieving or getting what they want, and what kind of actions do they tend to take in order to get there? And that can be described by 10th house placements.
Yeah, absolutely. Even the types of talent, skill, interest, it varies depending on the condition of the planet and what have you. But yeah, the kinds of things that you would like to, in your ideal setting would form part of your career.
Sure. So it can sometimes be like skills or like almost like technical abilities.
Yeah, whether it's a talent or a particular set of problems that you're drawn to solve, or in a work environment. I mean, Mars indications can talk about military, for instance. It's not the only indication of Mars, but it's one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. And so when we're talking about career, one of the things that's sometimes tricky is people want it to be very clear and specific. Like they want to come to an astrologer and have the astrologer point to their birth chart and say, you will be this or you will do this.
Yeah.
But one of the tricky things about vocational astrology, of being able to try to determine a person's vocation based on their birth chart, is that some of the placements when they are there in the 10th house, or when you're looking at the ruler of the 10th house, will give you like an archetype, which will give you a range of possible manifestations of like possible career choices that would be in alignment with the symbolism of that placement.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be, on the one hand, useful sometimes to narrow it down if you have no idea, but on the other hand, can sometimes be frustrating if somebody comes in wanting very concrete and singular, like this is the only thing that you're meant to do in your life.
Right. Well, and that's an error in thinking for most people, that there is one career out there for me and I have but to find it.
Yes.
Like that's simply not true for a lot of people.
No, it's
Sure.
Some people have that, and that's going to look different in a chart. Some people are going to do one thing for 20 years and another thing for 30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people are going to try to juggle 2 or 3 things the whole time.
Yeah. And other times, that you're working within a range because the planets associated with the 10th, if it is Mercury, for instance, there's a variety of things that you could do that would fulfill Mercury in the 10th.
Mm-hmm.
But you may not do things that were more Saturnian, for instance. So, Mercury can do writing, could be journalism, could be broadcasting, you can do radio, you can do podcasting. There's a bunch of things that Mercury there could do, but it's probably not going to do the Mars things, maybe not the Venus things, unless Venus is involved in some capacity.
Yeah. Well, and that, you would look at the ruler of the 10th in relationship to whatever planet's in the 10th. And, vocational astrology is just like, just like with the 7th, the 7th tells you a lot about relationships. You wouldn't only look at the 7th if you're going to do a complete portrait of relational stuff, right? 4th tells you about family. It's not the only thing
that tells you about family.
Right.
Yeah.
So you would never do a vocational analysis without including the 10th. But you would be incomplete if you only included the 10th.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so while sometimes 10th house placements, the ruler of the 10th, can describe specific like careers or vocations or occupations the person will gravitate towards, sometimes it can just describe like types of experiences that they will have in pursuing their vocation or in pursuing a career at different points in their life.
Yes. And even, whether you would have a steady, consistent career or whether you have a career that is marked by a lot of chopping and changing, that type of thing.
Right. Like let's say somebody has like Uranus in the 10th and maybe they have a predisposition to have like a unique career or like a unique vocation that is like outside of the mainstream or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Or let's
And then
say,
even just like I was thinking, like mutable signs versus fixed signs, for instance, the need for variety and change versus the need for stability and consistency.
sure.
Yeah.
What are some other things like that? Like I think of sometimes, so we've mentioned like Mercury, you mentioned Mercury, for example, and like something about communications, being involved in career, or like writing or speaking. Venus could be something having to do with artistic matters
Mm-hmm.
or the arts. Mars, you mentioned like military things potentially, but we could say like athletics,
Yeah.
Yeah.
sports.
Engineering.
Yeah.
People who work, like if you work at a steel plant, that's going to look like, so pre-modern, if somebody had Mars in the 10th, you would be like, oh yeah, you'll be the blacksmith.
Yeah.
Right. So that looks like
Yes.
working in a steel foundry, or,
Yeah.
working in a factory, working in engineer, either as an engineer or, I don't know, dunking the tubes in the acid bath to remove impurities, like,
Yes.
heavy, gnarly metal stuff.
Right.
Very intense kind of. Yeah.
Saturn, one of the ways I see Saturn a lot is Saturn in the 10th, depending on all the things it depends on, administrative roles where it's like, okay, it's your job to make sure everything's organized.
Yeah. To manage it.
And of course, in accord with Saturn in the 10th, if you're trying to make sure everybody else is sort of on the same page and coordinated, that means you kind of take on everybody else's problems, and you get to experience that malefic quality.
And that brings up another thing. Saturn sometimes, especially if it's having problems in the charts placed in the 10th, can sometimes show, on the one hand, like inhibitions in the person's actions, that sometimes their initial response when presented with the need to take action can be inaction, or like not taking action, because Saturn that's one of Saturn's significations, is inaction. So sometimes it just describes a person's initial impulse in taking action. So Mars might be the opposite, and like being too quick to take action, or jumping into things or diving into things prematurely.
Like an impulsiveness.
Sure.
Yeah.
But also I've seen charts, like I think I had a client once where they had Saturn in the 10th, and somehow it was connected with like the 4th or something. And it was, the person had a career and stuff. There was some career that the person wanted to pursue. Maybe it was like the ruler of the 9th was in the 10th, and it was Saturn, and it was connected somehow with the parents. And the issue was that her mother, when the woman was in college, dissuaded her and stopped her from continuing to go to school, to stay in college. And she ended up regretting that in the long term, and felt like that inhibited her in the long term in terms of her career. And that was something that came up at different points when Saturn was activated later in life by the Saturn cycle, was just that feeling that she had been inhibited in some way through this connection between the 9th and 10th house topics. So sometimes seeing connections between the 9th house of education, and remembering that the 9th house as a precursor to the 10th is sometimes the education or training that goes into whatever you end up doing in the 10th house.
Yeah. Yeah. So in your example, I guess she constantly had these doors closing for her professionally because she didn't have the right education or training.
Yeah, just that Saturn in the 10th described not her career so much, but more that she had this feeling that she had been held back by a choice that she made early in life, and that it was something that continued to be a struggle for her. So just potentially, let's say, delineation of Saturn in the 10th, where maybe you struggle in some ways with career, or have even like fears surrounding matters pertaining to your career that becomes something that you have to work through at different points in your life with greater or lesser success, depending on sort of how you navigate that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other ways that I see Saturn connections to the 10th show up is for people who work for the government in some capacity.
Okay.
So something about the structure and the stability and the pension kind of setup that is often, certainly in Australia and Canada, where there is like a generally good like health benefits package and retirement sort of savings. But and whether there's something in there too, because I think what you're saying there, Chris, is, Saturn has that inhibiting factor, so it can delay or it can deny. So it may, again, be doing work that creates stability and security rather than, is work that you love.
Sure. Or finding one's career, or life's work later in life.
Later in
say.
life. Yeah. Like
it's
the
going to
fine
work out
wine.
better
Yeah.
later. Also, as we've said with the other houses, the house in which the ruler of the 10th falls gives you a lot of information.
Hugely important.
Where you mentioned the person who was an acolyte of mortuary science with the ruler of the 10th and the 8th.
Yeah.
So, I have the ruler of the 10th and the 9th. So, I do astrology.
Yeah.
Which helps refine what is Austin going to talk about if Mercury's in the 10th? Well, the ruler's in the 9th. So it's going to be 9th house topics.
Yeah.
Right. If it's the ruler's in the 2nd, then your job is stuff.
Yeah.
And money.
Money. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking of some other delineations. So we've talked about ruler of the 10th and the 7th, and maybe like ending up in a career field and finding your partner there at work, let's say, or working with your partner. Ruler of the 10th and the 4th, and doing something, working from home. Could be a delineation.
Or family business.
Okay. And then ruler of the 10th and the 5th can be either working with children, but it can also be working in a creative industry as well. I think Tina Turner is someone who has the ruler of the 10th and the 5th. And I have a feeling, I want to say it's Venus in Sagittarius, but I'm just trying to think if that makes sense. Oh, yeah, it would. Yeah, Taurus 10th with Sag on the 5th.
Okay.
Yeah. And so like the legs and the dancing come in.
Sure.
I mean, it's in some ways it's a little bit literal, but yeah, the rule of the 10th and the 5th, the children versus the creative artistic outlets.
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely seen that with working with children.
Yeah, and you could work with children in a variety of ways. You could be a child psychologist, you could be a teacher in a school, you could do early childhood education or childcare of some capacity. So then you have to obviously get into the nuances of the elements and the modes and the other aspects and configurations. But the house placement of the ruler of the 10th is hugely critical to giving you the complete story around career.
Yeah.
In the chart.
I think it's like Judy Blume's chart, who's writes children's books, and she's like a award-winning children's book author.
Yeah.
Has the ruler of the 10th and the 5th, although she also has a stellium of like 4 planets in the 5th.
Right.
It's a little complicated.
Well, yeah, but then the award-winning, she was writing children's book when I was a child.
Okay.
Like she's been, if it's the Judy Blume one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that like,
I don't think there are a lot of
famous
children's writers named Judy Blume.
Yeah, I'm like, she's been writing, she's a long time famous.
Sure.
Is she still alive?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good for her.
But we have a time chart for her, and she's one of my favorite examples. Lisa actually found that example.
She's on the gram all the time.
Oh, is she?
She's teaching writing or something.
Okay. Other 10th house stuff, ruler of the 10th and the 3rd, I've seen with somebody who teaches elementary school. Ruler of the 10th.
I've also seen that with some people who do writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ruler of the 10th and the 11th, you might end up working with groups or with your friends, and so on and so forth. Ruler of the 10th and the 6th, there was the doctor we mentioned earlier that worked with especially like patient care and improving their experience.
Yes. One of the things that's nice about doing ruler of the 10th in is that it's often pretty literal.
Yeah.
Right.
And again, these are significations that take a while to bloom because if we're looking for a career which is intentionally sought and built and you get into the right thing rather than just what's around, that takes time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
In some ways, something like a health problem is easier to see because you don't have to work to get to the right health problem.
No. It's like my back is sore. Okay, well, let's treat the back.
It finds you.
Yes.
Whereas you have to kind of work to get the right 10th house thing.
Well, and by working at it, which is sort of a little bit of a play on words there, but you sometimes have to do a few jobs that are close to what you're looking for to get clarity on exactly what it is that you want.
Well, and with multiple, when you have multiple significations around the 10th, you'll see that that person will probably do a couple things and they'll probably try to stick with a thing that's the good fit.
Yes.
But, like I have significations for extremely low grade labor.
Yeah.
And so I did that for a while.
For a long time.
And I also have significations for being an astrologer.
Yeah.
And, I decided that would be something I would stick with.
That was a better fit with, you didn't want to stay in the, what was the labor part? How did you say?
I said low
Low grade,
wage,
low
low
wage,
skill labor.
low skilled labor.
Like when I did
yeah.
light assembly work at the
Yeah.
factory,
Yeah.
greasing oven door hinges.
Wowzers.
Right. Or I
Yeah.
think about like James Holden, who worked for a full like 40 or 50 years, had an entire career as I think he was like an electrician or something like that. And then eventually retired from it. But on the side, ever since college, he'd been like just translating ancient astrological texts in his spare time. And then eventually, after he retired from his like engineering job, he decided to like publish a bunch of 30 translations or something like that over the course of the next 20 or 30 years until he eventually passed away, I think in like 2013.
Yeah.
So there's also sometimes a difference between sometimes what a person does for work or what they do in one phase of their life versus what they end up becoming known for or what they do in another phase of their life.
Totally.
Yeah. And worth noting, as with all the angular houses, the 10th is really strong. Any planet that's placed in the 10th will have a global impact on the chart.
It's very, very potent. Yeah. It sits at the top. You know, well, we talked about the 4th house as being like the foundation. I always think of the 10th house stuff as like, this is just a made up Kelly thing, but it's like the planet that sits on the top of your head like a crown almost.
Oh, that's great. I was just going to say, again, if you
won't find that in any ancient text, but just to give you a visual.
No, but you will. If you have like a bunch of if we're ascertaining the rank of the native, any of the systems that do that, 10th house planets are going to give you a higher rank. Like if you were born a duke or a duchess, then like that changes everything, right? Like you could have exactly the same character and interest, but if you were born a commoner, right, versus you're born like a viceroy, right? Like it's a different life.
It's a different lifestyle. You have different opportunities, and yeah, absolutely.
So before we move on from the 10th house, I think it's kind of important, and I know it gets us a little bit into the house division thing, which I don't want to dwell on too much, but we should maybe touch on, since we're using whole sign houses here and our approach is the three of us, using the degree of the MC and the fact that we still do that and that is important and that it can import 10th house significations into whatever whole sign house it falls in.
Well, and especially planets conjoined it. Like if you have a planet on the midheaven in the 9th, that planet is super important for reputation and career.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to indicate not just 9th house, whole sign house, if it's in the 9th whole sign house, but it's also going to indicate 10th house career matters. So there's a doubling up of significations.
Yes.
So
it's like a roving point that can pull things into 10th house topics.
Yeah. And I think that's really important just because sometimes people, when they first learn about whole sign houses, don't realize that you need to pay attention to that or need to do that. And they might reject it because they'll say, well, this planet conjunct my midheaven clearly is having some things to do in describing my career. So therefore, maybe only quadrant houses work. But if you pay attention to it and you know that you're supposed to be paying attention to the overlapping of significations, that becomes an important factor in terms of judging how these different approaches work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the MC is so critical. It can't be ignored in this regard.
Sure.
Yeah.
And also sometimes the MC falling in whole sign houses other than the 10th sign can import and tell you career things that the person will gravitate towards. So
it's kind of helpful when that happens.
Yeah, it's really helpful.
It's like, oh, your MC is in the 9th. Right, we just need to talk about 9th house things because the 9th house topics become relevant to the career.
Yeah, so a good example of that one of the first discoverers or guys that helped to rediscover whole sign houses and wrote one of the first monographs on it was Rob Hand, the famous late 20th and early 21st century astrologer. And he has Scorpio or his Cancer rising, and the degree of the midheaven, even though he has Cancer rising in Aries as the 10th whole sign house, the degree of his midheaven falls in Pisces in the 9th whole sign house. So it imports 10th house career significations into the 9th house. And of course, he ends up making a lifelong career as an astrologer and becomes one of the most famous astrologers in modern times.
Yeah. And partly because of some of the books that he's published on astrology too, if we go back to the publishing and 9th house piece. Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah.
Other possible combinations of that, I have my midheaven in my 11th whole sign house.
Yeah.
So importing career matters over into the place of friends and the idea that perhaps friends might be involved in my career. I'm still trying to figure out how that might be the case. I don't know.
It's really hard to figure that out.
Yeah.
It's kind of abstract.
Let's keep thinking about if any listeners have any ideas, write in and let us know, or let us know in the comment section below.
Yeah.
And hopefully I can figure out what I'm supposed to be doing at some point. Yeah.
Like, you have the midheaven in the 10th?
Yes.
Yeah, me
too. My chart's pretty consistent. You can put it in any house system and it'll come out.
Okay.
I'm thinking of someone I know whose life's work, they were an academic and a Taoist priest. Midheaven in the 9th.
Midheaven in the 9th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Pretty
Absolutely.
simple.
So, yeah. So,
and that's not just a natal placement, but what's really cool and how you can verify that especially is by following transits, especially outer planet transits when they start going through that other whole sign house. Like if you have the MC in the 9th whole sign house and the planet, like let's say Saturn, hits the degree of that, and you see both the 9th house and the 10th house topics coming into play at the same time, then you can kind of validate it from a more practical or empirical standpoint.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So transits through the 10th impact your career and reputation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And transits through the sign of the MC.
Right.
I wouldn't say I wouldn't say the whole sign of the MC.
Just the degree.
I would look at maybe a couple 5-6 degrees out from the MC, but I wouldn't, like if somebody had the MC at 27 Pisces in the 9th, I wouldn't be I wouldn't be looking for professional outputs if Saturn was at 2 degrees of Pisces.
Okay.
See, I think you will start seeing, as soon as the planet goes into that sign, inklings of that starting to build up of both of those topics. Or also the same with the IC. Like if the IC falls in the 3rd house, it'll be importing like 4th house topics into the 3rd house. So sometimes when you have an outer planet going through that sign, you'll see matters pertaining to siblings as well as like the home and living situation coming up at that time.
Yeah, I treat it as an outpost rather than a whole second 10th house.
Okay. Got it. All right, I'm trying to think anything else, but is that it for the 10th?
It's, like all of the, we've kind of come to this point with all of the angular houses. Where they're powerful and they're kind of simple. Mm-hmm. It's what do you do?
They do,
right? Like
they're very much the one top. It's not that they're just the one topic, but it's the main thing.
But it's such a big thing,
huge,
that it has a giant impact.
Yeah,
and, with like 1, 7, 4, 10, right? It's the 4 basic questions about a person. First, I don't know, what are they like? 7th, who are they with? 4th, where are they from? 10th, what do they do?
Yeah,
and then everything else is details.
Yeah,
yeah. And also it's worth mentioning in an electional context that over and over again, if you read the ancient electional texts, they have this system that's just based on the 4 angles where the 1st house represents you, the one initiating the action. The 7th house represents, if there's another party, the person receiving the action, like in, let's say, a buyer-seller relationship. The 10th house represents the action that is taken, or in some instances, like if it's a buyer-seller thing, it indicates like the product. And then the 4th house represents the outcome or the end result of the action. Mm-hmm. So that's a really useful thing to keep in mind in electional charts, but it also gives you a framework for understanding the broader underlying archetypal meaning of the 4 angles as well. Like 1st house you, 7th house other, 10th house action, 4th house outcome.
Outcome. Yeah.
Yeah. And in other electional horary contexts, like the 10th is your boss. If you're like, how am I if I do this with my boss, if I propose this, you would take the 10th as the indicator of the boss and the 1st as the indicator of you.
Yeah.
I was doing a unit on electional astrology in my year 2 class. And I basically said, elect any kind of thing that you want for the next class. And so one student elected a prison break, it was genius. It was beautiful, except they'd elected the ruler of the 10th was on top of the ruler of the 1st. And so I was like, this is a beautiful plan, but the warden is going to be looking right at you.
Yeah, the boss has got their eyes on you.
Yeah, everything else about it was just genius.
Yeah.
But it was fun.
Yes, it's a very creative approach to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a good exercise to like think about different things like that, and like what would the electional chart be if you were to try to initiate this action, and what symbolically would it indicate success in that action from your standpoint, versus what would indicate your failure, and that the other party, if there's another party involved, might be the one successful in that action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's it for the 10th house.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, let's transition into our next house, which is the 11th house. So traditionally in ancient Hellenistic astrology, the 11th house is known as the place of good spirit, and that is opposite to the place of good fortune, which is the 5th place. The 11th house is said to be the joy, or said to be the place where Jupiter rejoices. So the 11th is traditionally associated with Jupiter. In terms of significations, pretty standard set of significations for most of the astrological tradition is friends, groups, alliances, and also hopes or wishes. The 11th house is a succedent house, and that's actually, I think, going back to the very earliest strata of the tradition, that's a large part of the reason why the 11th house signifies hopes, which is kind of like a weird, almost looks like a weird abstract signification until you look at astronomically what planets in the 11th house are doing,
Yes.
which is they're rising up towards
They're
the 10th
aspiring.
house.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're aspiring, or they're reaching for something, but they're not there yet. They wish to be there, and they're sort of reaching out for it in that way, but they haven't quite got there yet.
No. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's, I think when you understanding that hopes and wishes part of the 11th house just kind of makes so much more sense. Otherwise, it is this weird thing that's just tucked in there and you don't know why.
Right.
But it's like you're 3/4 of the way up the mountain and you're seeing where you're going and you want to get there. You're just not quite there yet.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So primarily though, in terms of like practical significations that are really useful and comes up super frequently, is just the 11th house is the primary place that represents friends, and the role that friends and friendship plays in your life, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also extend that to colleagues.
Sure.
The people that you're in the same group as. And I, like when we go to an astrology conference, we're in our 11th house.
Yes.
And we're like friends with some people and good friends with other people and colleagues with other people.
Yeah.
But they're still all in the 11th.
Yeah.
And so the 11th is both relational, right, as a trine to the 7th, but it is also, because it's pretty high in the sky, it's reputational. Planets in the 11th will definitely affect the way that people think about you.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. For better or for worse. And then what you can do based on that reputation.
Yeah. So affecting your reputation, friends, groups. Groups isn't like a traditional signification in that like balance as friends, and alliances is pretty traditional, but groups is more of a modern one. But it definitely comes up like when you see like a career significator placed in the 11th house, like working with groups or large organizations.
Yeah.
Can often be like a common manifestation of that.
Yeah. Community projects, that type of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Like projects where people are working together for some larger purpose,
Yeah,
or some social purpose.
Exactly. Yeah. It is to sort of contribute to the group in some way. Yeah. Like social services type of thing.
Right.
Come up there.
So the 11th house can also have to deal with not just physically or literally like things with friends, but also a person's attitude towards friends or towards friendship.
Yes. Yeah. And you hear people, I know one astrologer years ago said to me, I've got the South Node in the 11th house. I don't like going to conferences type of thing.
Yeah. I know somebody that had like the Saturn in the 11th and had a fear of like social things. And he didn't have that many friendships because he feared like putting himself in social situations and actively avoided it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then had a major Saturn transit at one point, like a Saturn return. And that was part of that transit, was like pushing himself to sort of push through that.
To do that more.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then obviously you have like the friendlier planets, if you like, Venus, the moon, the sun, potentially, that are going to be more warm or enjoying the social group conference type environment. Yeah.
Yeah. Or let's say another one could be having benefics there, like Venus and Jupiter, and having it very well situated and having benefits from friends. Like sometimes like getting a leg up in your career as a result of your buddy who helps you out, for example, or something like that.
Yeah, having well-connected individuals or having almost like a benefactor who might speak on your behalf. Yeah.
Yeah, I also see it in terms of people who have audiences. You very often see the audience clearly described by what's going on with the 11th. So if you're a writer or you do something, you're a performer, you run a podcast, what's going on the 11th will often give you a lot of information about audience.
Sure.
Yeah.
One of my favorite examples is Kurt Cobain, who had a Moon-Jupiter conjunction in the 11th in Cancer, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I partially always associated that with him getting together with his high school buddy, Chris Novoselic, and then forming this band, Nirvana, which ended up becoming the hugest band at the time.
Yeah, but if you read it as audience, like this is an audience, he had an audience that was loyal 30 years after his death, like crying at his grave every year. Like it's tremendous, and also just huge financial gain as a result. And that's actually one signification that I've become, I would say, more interested in over the last year because I've seen it more, is you will see as a secondary signification, the 11th being the second from the 10th and being gains from one's professional action.
Yeah.
And I've seen 11th house stuff, the 11th house ruler and benefics in the 11th when triggered, turning into money lots and lots and lots of times. That I will use it as one of the financial indicators.
Yeah, well, it's the substance from the 10th, right?
Yeah.
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 The materia from the 10th.
And it's definitely one of the most positive houses in terms of just the qualitative.
Did we say that?
No.
I think we missed that part.
Well, we haven't said anything negative yet.
No, we haven't, but we haven't been explicit to say why, because one of the ways the 11th was described to me is like manna from heaven rains down on you. And I'm like, this is pretty good.
I don't
I don't know if I would quite go with that. I'm not like, but Chris, yeah, sorry. Do you want to fill in the gap?
I mean, one of the things I would say is just it's a succedent house. It's configured by a superior sextile to the rising sign. And it's also said to be the place associated with Jupiter. So you sort of like put all of those together and you end up with a pretty good picture in terms of it being one of the most positive houses in terms of the usual ranking, which puts like the first, 10th, I think 11th, and then 5th as being probably the best houses.
Yeah, I would agree.
in terms of favorability.
Yeah.
Sure.
What I would say that the 11th is one of the things about the 11th that keeps it from the top spot is that it is less volitional than, say, the 1st and the 10th.
Yeah, it's not angular.
Because you benefit because you know the right person, or you're part of the right set, you're part of the right network.
Yeah.
You are to some degree dependent on others.
And the quality of the network counts, your ability to access it and then the quality of it.
Yeah. And it's configured to the rising by sextile, but it's configured to the 7th by trine. And so we see from the very beginning, we've been talking about it in very social terms.
Yes.
And so you are to some degree dependent on, the whims of the audience.
Yes.
Who you happen to know, who you happen to be around, who you happen to meet, who you happen to be colleagues with or whatever.
And to a certain extent, who you gel with in that department.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that there aren't lots of benefits, but it's less like, it's less volitional than the 1st.
You don't control it as much directly. It's sort of like there's some.
Like if I said, if we were like we could say, okay, work really hard on your career thing. That's 10th house. Mm-hmm. Work really hard on making friends. You can put energy into that, but there are literally lots of other people involved.
Yes.
And you can't fake chemistry.
No.
Because
it's the same with. Just to stay on the friendship track, like you can put a lot of effort into meeting people, but you can't always control what the outcome of that meeting is going to be.
Right.
And that's where the magic or the chemistry, it's either there or it's not there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although typically with the 11th, that is where you find people that are on the same wavelength with you and you just happen to jive with in terms of either intellectually or on a spirit type level. versus the 12th house, which is where you run into people that you just don't jive with or that are working at cross purposes to you sometimes through no fault of your own.
Yeah.
And I think that's where where the 11th house significations came with, going back to like some of the work that I did on the planetary joys, is I think the original author or authors or whoever that came up with the system of planetary joys that divided the chart into those two halves, where the bottom half was the lunar realm that was under the earth and had more to do with the body. And the top half of the chart was like the solar realm that had more to do with the spirit and the mind. And so when you look at the 5th house, the place of good fortune associated with Venus, that's a place that has to do with good things that pertain to the body because it's in the bottom half of the chart. But the 11th house then becomes a good house that has to do with things that pertain to the mind or the spirit.
Yeah.
And one of the things, or one of the ways that that's connected is that's where friendship, and in some of the ancient definitions, that's what friendship is just a connection in being on the same wavelength with somebody in terms of a connection in spirit or in terms of your intellect or what have you.
Like the like mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if you're not necessarily like getting together like you would with a 7th house person or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if we think of Jupiter being in its joy there, if Jupiter, one image for Jupiter could be the preacher, like the 11th is the preacher at their congregation. Like that's literally the best place for that figure.
Yeah. To be with the people of like mind.
Sure.
Rejoicing in the good spirit.
Yeah, the good, yeah.
I would almost think of that more in like a 9th house, whereas the 11th house is more like the community organizer, the person that gets involved in politics and finds other people who have similar political views, and then they organize together to accomplish something as a team.
But that's what a congregation is. Like I would say the Jupiter in the 9th is like being at seminary, right? Like that's at the temple, like preaching unto the people of a community. Like that's the 11th house. And Jupiter imports, all the Jupiter significations into whatever house it's in. But who is it easiest to speak the truth to? The people who are like, yes, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, like that preaching to the choir idea.
Yeah, it's literally Jupiter in the 11th is preaching to the choir.
Yeah. Well, the 11th house, a great example of like the gathering of the like mind would be Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. I don't know if you remember her chart. Sun, Mars, Midheaven, Mercury, all in the 11th.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. So she's got that very strong focus. And if you see the Netflix documentary, Taking Down the House, Burning Down the House, I can't remember what it's called, about the New Democrats. It follows her campaign to get elected, and it really speaks to how she had to mobilize the community to get on board and get her elected. So there'd be some 3rd house things there as well, but that idea of finding a tribe of people that are, sharing that sort of vision or that good spirit, like we are passionate about that same type of thing.
Well, and just politics is a really good topic because you will find in most very successful politicians' charts something very strong in the 11th.
Well, Bill Clinton had the sun in Leo.
Well, and the ability
in the 11th specifically.
The ability to network, like networking is a very like 11th house activity because it's a social activity. But it's a social activity involving like many people or involving lots of people in groups rather than just sitting down one-on-one and spending an extended period just trying to build one relationship. You're trying to build many relationships.
Yeah. And if you're in a democracy or something like that, where you get positions of power through popularity, then the 11th is an 11th house. Important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also benefits with friends. And we've talked about benefits with friends in terms of if you have positive placements.
As opposed to the converse.
Like different from friends with benefits.
Right, yeah. Well, no, but we should talk about the actual converse, which is if, let's say, you have challenging placements in the 11th house and scenarios where, let's just say, broadly, the most broad statement you could make is like difficulties with friends or difficulties with the topic of friendship. So we talked about an example of like somebody who had a fear of friends or had difficulty making friends. Yeah. Or I've seen other scenarios of somebody that had like one main friend growing up, but they had the ruler of the 11th house of friends and the 8th house of death, and that person passed away relatively early in their lives, and it kind of traumatized the native, where the death of her friend was a major negative sort of like turning point for her in her life.
Hugely so.
Yeah, or you have the situation where, like, you know, somebody's a good kid, but they're hanging out with the wrong crowd.
Yes.
Yeah, getting like dragged down by your friends, or having your friends qualitatively make your life worse in some way, let's say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a horror years ago where there was an 11th house, and it was like the mother was asking about the daughter, you know, what's wrong? You know, she seems to be struggling at school, blah, blah, blah. And there was a malefic in the 11th house, and it was like, well, can you change her social network somehow? Yeah. So the 11th, I guess, so basically it's going to tell us about the experiences with friends, whether they are positive and supportive and you enjoy them, or whether there are some challenges or limitations or restrictions there.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also transits through the 11th house can sometimes indicate the timing or the triggering of events related to that.
Oh, I got a good one.
Okay.
So when Jupiter was in my 11th house some years ago, and when it perfectly sextiled the degree of my rising, you handed off the presidency of the AYA to me.
Okay.
And we didn't plan it for the transit. We're like, oh, we'll do it at the conference.
Yeah.
I remember looking, which was UAC 2012. And I remember looking at my transits, and I was like, oh, Jupiter in my 11th is perfectly sextile my own rising in Jupiter, like that week.
Nice.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I was in an 11th house perfection year, I think, when I became president of the Association for Young Astrologers several years prior to that.
Did you start that organization?
No. I was like the third something president or something. They had started it several years before I came along, but I had my degree of my midheaven in the 11th whole sign house, as we mentioned earlier. But that activation of going into 11th house perfection year was like being involved in a group, but with the midheaven career significator also there, it was like that being partially a job or becoming president of that group. So rising to prominence within the context of a group situation.
Yeah.
And so for me, I obtained the presidency in a 10th house perfection. So that's like, you know, getting a role.
The lead person.
Yeah. That's what we just finished talking about how that's what the 10th house is.
Absolutely. The prominence. Yeah.
And then, but, you know, what was the transit that did that? Oh, it was an 11th house.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think I had Jupiter going through there as well at the same time. So to echo the transit you had, was Jupiter's going through my 11th house.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other 11th house transits or observations that you guys have seen? I mean, I've seen people have like a difficult transit through the 11th and like losing a friend.
Oh, I had that.
Yeah.
I just had that last year with the Mars and Saturn conjunct in Capricorn. And there was this very bizarre altercation with a friend where I got sort of just attacked actually by this friend at my house when I was hosting an event for this person. It was so bizarre. But I had two other friends there that kind of stood up and just like I could see them. You know when you're not aware, or you kind of miss something, and I'm like, they sound like they're defending me. What's really going on here? But anyway, it ended up that it caused this huge drama in our social network, and you know, the person who sort of started this big drama ended up just sort of being lost as a friend, or lost to the whole group, if you like. So yeah, that was a bit of drama to do with just a combination of both malefics there.
Yeah, and you have a benefic natally there.
Yeah.
So even though the transit was negative, like the natal pattern was like, no. There were people who rose up were like, no. Kelly's great.
We got her back. And so that you're right. Absolutely. Yeah. But the challenge of losing a friend. Yeah.
Yeah. I had something similar where there was a Mars-Saturn conjunction, I think once on the ruler of my 11th. And it was the first time I had a friend who had a mental breakdown and suddenly started struggling with mental health issues to an extent that I had never experienced before. And the culmination of that transit was like having to talk with their family and attempting to get them committed to a hospital because they became like a danger to themselves, and it became like a really serious situation.
Yeah.
So sometimes, again, that's a situation of like not always representing you, but sometimes other people in your life that are important to you in different ways and what's going on in their lives.
Yes. Yeah. And the ruler of your 11th is in
I mean, ruler of the 11 is in the 12th.
It's in the 12th because I'm like, the
Right.
things you're talking about, I'm like, that they're all 12th house topics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Super interesting. So it all comes out of the 11th house, all the friendship stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did we go through house ruler delineations? I guess maybe we did. Like, let's say ruler of 11 and 10, and maybe career matters being tied up in friendships or groups.
Mm-hmm.
Ruler of 11 and 9 could be like making a friend who's from a foreign country.
Yeah.
Religious friend.
Yeah.
Ruler of 11 and 7 I've seen that it manifest as people who end up getting in a significant long-term relationship with somebody who started off as a friend.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Ruler of the 11th and the 4th, you hang out with your family,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You know, extended family networks.
Sure.
Yeah.
Or you're friends with your parents or something like
Yeah,
that.
or you hang
Yeah.
out with your cousins and your uncles or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. So is that it for the 11th house? Is there anything we need to touch on that we didn't before we move on?
It's a good workable place
It's a
for
really
any planet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and also as one of the most positive houses, one of the reasons why that's important is because oftentimes if the ruler of another house is in the 11th, it will often indicate that the topics associated with that ruler will tend to go a little bit better than if they were placed in other parts of the chart.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it can be an automatic indication of like favorable or more favorable outcomes for the topic of the ruler of whatever house that is that's placed in the 11th.
Yeah.
It'll tend to find itself in a supportive network.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Unless there are very
gets-
specific things that say otherwise, you can assume that's the case.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as a succeedent house that's building up, it's usually something that gets better over time or increases and becomes better over time.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I see. So in terms of the succeedant houses, I do tend to look at them as resources. Second house, it's literally the stuff.
Yeah.
Eighth house, it's other people's stuff. Fifth house, it's it's your personal mojo. It's like it's an internal resource.
Yeah.
And the 11th house is social resource.
That's a beautiful way of describing it, actually. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Shall we transition into our final of 12 houses?
Ooh,
Ooh la la.
into the darkness.
Away from the good.
All right. So transitioning into house 12. So the 12th house in ancient Hellenistic Greco-Roman astrology was known as the place of bad spirit, as a sort of next to the place of the 11th, which is the house of good spirit. So again, this is in the top half of the chart, which is the solar hemisphere, and that's why they're calling some of these houses as having to do with the mind or the spirit, which is the solar realm, as opposed to the houses below the horizon that have to do with the lunar realm, which they're associating with the idea of fortune and the body. So 12th, bad spirit. The 12th is said to be the place where Saturn rejoices, or the place where Saturn has its joy. And so traditionally the 12th has been always associated with Saturn in ancient traditional astrology. Some of the 12th is a cadent house. It's also a house that is not configured to the rising sign. So as a result of this, in a lot of the traditional texts, the 12th house is treated as the worst or the most negative of the negative houses, or as the most difficult house in general. Since it has no aspect of the rising sign, it's cadent, and also only has a weak sextile with the midheaven or the 10th, whereas the 6th house, which is also cadent and not aspecting the rising sign, at least has a superior trine with the 10th or the midheaven. In terms of significations on the poster, we've got enemies, sickness, loss, and seclusion as being the primary significations in terms of trying to fit just like 4 on there that I was able to fit as what I thought were 4. I know the first 3 are definitely pretty standard traditional ones going back 2,000 years. So enemies, sickness, and loss as a general signification, but I think seclusion is also more of a modern one that's very relevant as well. What do you guys think of these 4 significations? Do you endorse, or do you?
I would go 6th for enemies, and I would go self-undoing.
Yeah, I do
for
like the
12th.
self-undoing for the
Because
12.
you see self-sabotage, you see a lot of addictive behavior. You just you see the native acting against their own interest with planets in the 12th so consistently.
Sure.
And if a planet's in the 12th, it's looking right at the 6th and vice versa. But yeah, I would go enemies. I would go 6th primary.
Okay. Yeah, and the idea of self-undoing, especially in the past few centuries, has become a major 12th house signification, I think partially because the 12th is part of the angular triad associated with the ascendant. And so it's planets in the 12th are declining or falling away from the first. And if the first house is the native or the self, then the 12th is something that might decline or take away or detract from the first.
Diminish you in some way.
Right.
Yeah. The one other word that I really like for the 12th house is suffering.
Yeah.
It's not it's appropriate for the 12th house.
It is.
It's very appropriate. I know. Sure. I know. I was very excited about that word though, wasn't I? It's very relevant to the nature of the 12th house because I think whether it's self-undoing or otherwise, when we suffer, we're often isolated, but because of the bad spirit piece, part of the suffering this is where we get the mental health and the psychological pieces coming in, is the suffering is to do with those intangible things that kind of just sit inside us that we churn around.
Sure.
And depending on what planets you may have in the 12th, it can indicate your personal suffering or it may indicate you being a helper for people who are suffering along those lines.
Well, it's an involvement with usually invisible suffering.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it's invisible and it's in the realm of spirit.
Yeah.
And so it's very perfectly, it does a very good job of framing what we now call mental health issues. It's in the realm of spirit, but it's the worst house in the realm of spirit.
Yeah.
It's invisible, right? It's not configured to the rising. It's the silent suffering of being depressed or whatever.
Absolutely. And the fact that it in many mental health conditions look invisible in the sense that you can look at someone and not realize that they are sick or unwell because it's not like they're walking around with their leg in the cast or they've lost their hair because of chemotherapy. They are suffering in a way that seems invisible.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at some of the more enthusiastic forms of self-undoing, like somebody's nurturing a big, strong addiction, they conceal it.
Absolutely. Keep it a secret.
You try to keep it invisible.
Yes.
If you're drinking all day at work or whatever.
Yeah.
So the isolation is interesting. So two of the there are locations that we can associate with different houses. And so hospitals, mental and otherwise, are strongly associated with the 12th.
Right.
And one thing I think is interesting is, so the 12th is maybe seemingly ironically a very spiritual place.
Yes.
Because when you're just there with your thoughts, well, that's that's the practice of meditation. Or it's getting savaged by your thoughts, but that invisible struggle in the mental or spirit realm, that is by nature a spiritual contest.
Yes.
And so one of the ways that I think about the 6th and 12th often in relationship to each other. In the 6th, we're contesting with things externally, whether it's enemies or we're trying to, fix our stairs or we're struggling with our body. Whereas in the 12th, we're struggling with our mind. And then in a number of horary texts, I believe Lily included, if you do a horary to see whether someone is cursed and there's a spirit, an invisible spirit fucking with them, you look at the ruler of the 12th as the indicator of the curse.
Yeah.
Right? If there's a curse, right? And that's what it feels like, if people will use language like a curse, if I'm cursed with this addictive tendency, or can feel like a curse if you have to struggle with depression or anxiety or whatever, and it's invisible.
Yes.
Right? You can't see where it's coming from. And so it's just your mind versus whatever. One thing that's interesting is in Vedic astrology, the 12th as the place of self-undoing it's 90% the same as what we're talking about, but in the context of spiritual practices where you're trying to undo the ego, where you're literally trying to undo, it can be positive in that sense. It's still for more normal life stuff. It's all of the same significations we're talking about. But what's interesting is if you think of places of seclusion that people go to be by themselves to do this sort of spiritual contest, like so a monastery or an ashram or what, or a retreat, that like the structure of a monastery and the structure of a hospital or a jail is another 12th house thing.
Yep.
It's very similar. Do you know what you call the rooms in a monastery? You call them cells.
Yeah.
And what do? You go there and you sit by yourself and you think about what you've done.
Yes.
Which is exactly what you would do if you were committed to a mental institution or if you were forced into jail.
Yeah.
Galileo famously had Jupiter in Pisces in the 12th and predicted that he would be jailed for his beliefs.
Yeah, and he was.
Which he was.
Yeah.
Right. But
well, and he was under house arrest, so he had a slightly more comfortable imprisonment environment.
It was Jupiter in Pisces.
Yes, that's what I mean. So he still had the 12th house imprisonment, but he got to do it in the comfort of his own home.
Right.
And then it was like connected somehow with the ruler of his 10th, and he ended up writing some of his most important works later in life when he was under imprisonment, but then also unfortunately died under house arrest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, isolation. And I think that's one of the reasons why like places of isolation can be one of the significations associated with the 12th.
So let me jump in on that. I have the ruler of my rising in the 12th.
Yeah.
I need places of isolation.
That's the thing, is that it's not always like you're going to end up in prison, but it's like you need to spend time alone and you need to spend time in quiet, secluded settings. Because I see the 12th house as being away from the rest of the chart, if you like. It's very set apart in the same way that anyone in hospital or in a monastery or we used to call it the nunnery when we were kids, because my aunt is a Catholic nun, but the convent. You are separated, but it can be to your own benefit to be in that space at times.
Well, and so worth noting that, the 12th and the 11th have really, how should we say, almost polar relationships to the social.
Yes,
right? The 11th,
like completely different, opposite.
There are more people around in the 11th than any other house, and then there are the least people around in the 12th.
In the 12th, yeah. Absolutely. And then one way that I do see the 12th coming up in a very modern 21st century context, although it's not as though it's never been around before, is when people take themselves off to a retreat. They go on the silent meditation for 10 days, or I'm going to Bali to do a yoga thing for 2 weeks and I won't have any connection to the rest of the world.
And a traditional signification you see for the 12th is exile to foreign lands.
Oh my gosh, now I'm getting on my soapbox here. Yeah, I love the away part of the 12th house, because Grace Kelly has the ruler of the 7th in the 12th, and she's an example of going away to foreign lands for her relationship, because Grace Kelly, of course, married the Prince of Monaco and had to, go through all of that. So yeah, you do see this away of people going away from their original place with the 12th house.
Yeah, and that's because it's a cadent house. So it's another one of those houses where it's falling or it's moving away from the stability of the first house.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's if you think about being forced to live in a foreign land, which is different than taking a trip, right? It's different than that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And so think about that before airplanes and before handy-dandy language guides.
Oh, yeah,
right?
You were on a boat. I mean, even in the mid-20th century, many people were going back and forward between England and Australia, and it would take you weeks.
Well, and it was dangerous.
Yeah, you could die, get sick, they'd get scurvy.
Yeah, and you don't know the culture, and you can't Google stuff.
You can't speak the language, and if you're going on a trip like that,
and
you're
it's
actually
isolating.
You're leaving behind everyone you know, because a letter is going to take months to get back to them too. Weeks, maybe. Yeah.
Well, and there can sometimes even now still be an inherent vulnerability or sense of unsteadiness in traveling and in that place where you're sort of not in limbo, but you're in a transitional state. Like transitional states can be places of vulnerability in some sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%.
So in the 7th century, Rhetorius, he refers to the 12th as the place in between worlds, because
Yes.
he says that it's the 12th house is the sign that was rising in the hour or two before birth. So as a cadent or a declining house, it means while the mother was in labor, the sign that's on the 12th in the birth chart is the sign that was rising while the mother was in labor. And so he talks about the mother being in labor and the native being in between life and death at that point. And so this notion of being in between worlds becomes part of the underlying sort of motif of the 12th house from that perspective.
Also, that means that you are going through the most painful thing that you've ever experienced during that 12th house period, because you're being squeezed
through the birth
all
canal.
of the happy fluid that you were floating in, that's gone.
It's gone now.
You're now getting crushed.
Your skull is
and
being
pushed.
crushed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And your lungs are being compressed to try and force breath into them. I mean,
Yeah, birth trauma.
it's a thing.
Sure. So you're in that transitional state, but it's also a state of potential danger.
It's great vulnerability, because up until a couple of hundred years ago, childbirth was the leading cause of death for women, and many children didn't live out of their childhood.
Right.
It's phenomenally risky to be pregnant at certain points in history. There was a Greek word that I heard Demetra reference, and I may be bastardizing it here or pronouncing it incorrectly, but the idea of metacosmos, which I think speaks to that world between worlds.
Yeah, it's the
type
one that
of
means
energy.
that can be interpreted to mean in between worlds.
In between worlds, yeah.
Well, and also, so if we take some of the potentially useful, fruitful activities, maybe you ended up in the 12th house place of seclusion, maybe because you were exiled, maybe because you went to, you went to a monastery, maybe because you're in jail, but now you're in the seclusion place and it's just you and your mind.
Yes.
I just lost the point that I was going to.
That's all right. Before you move on, can we just stick with the, because I want to read Valens' Significations of the 12th really quickly from the 2nd century. So he says the 12th, foreign lands, enmities, slaves, injuries, dangers, judgments, suffering, death, and sickness. So one of the ones, because this is a recurring one all over the Hellenistic and even some of the medieval authors, even though there's a tendency to move towards treating the 12th as just self-undoing in the later tradition. In a lot of the earlier authors, they're treating the 11th as the place of friends and the house that follows after that, the 12th, as one of the places of enemies.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that that's represented, because that's why I put that on there, because it's a pretty consistent traditional signification that if there are friends, or if you can find the topic of friends in a person's chart, and that's primarily associated with the 11th, that the 12th is one of the primary places where you find enemies. And what you mean by that, in some sense, is people that work at cross purposes to you.
Work against you or undermine you.
Yeah, because sometimes, if a friendship is partially a connection between the spirit, or an affinity between the spirit of two people that just get along for sometimes reasons that are outside of their control, due to a sort of affinity, the 12th relative to the rising sign is a sign that shares no affinities with the first. And sometimes you just run into or meet people who you share no affinity with, or who you just don't get along with for some reason that may not even necessarily be your fault or either person's fault, but for some reason you end up running at cross purposes to each other. And I think sometimes when you meet objective 12th house individuals, those are the ones that sometimes the ancient authors might be qualifying there as enemies, quote unquote. Yeah.
Yeah. I do see the enemy sort of configuration, that idea of someone undermining you. And I do think it goes with the good spirit, bad spirit to a certain extent. But I know that you see it differently.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I wouldn't be surprised to find an enemy in the 12th.
Yeah.
I would look first at the 6th.
At the 6th. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, then that's fine if you do. I just want to mention it because it is a really consistent Hellenistic signification in terms of assigning enemies to the 12th. And that can come up sometimes in different ways when the ruler of, let's say, different houses are in the 12th, or in a house where you find difficult things like the 6th or 12th, that sometimes the person in your life that's represented by that house ruler can sometimes start working at cross purposes to you, which sometimes can mean they become like an enemy or somebody that works against you, somebody that ends up undermining you. Like, let's say the ruler of the third is in the 12th, and it can indicate loss or enmity with a sibling, like having a falling out with a sibling at some point in your life is I think a delineation that's in some of the texts pretty traditionally, or just going through various other houses. I know.
Well, I mean, to a certain degree, any house ruler that's in the 12th, there's going to be
problems.
Yeah, there are going to be problems.
Yeah.
And if it's a social house, then there will be problems with whoever those people are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, of sometimes just loss, like loss as being a 12th house signification.
Definitely.
Whereas
absolutely.
the 11th tends to be associated with gain. So sometimes it can mean losing and the dissipation of that person or the loss of that person from your life. Like I'm thinking of, I think like Yoko Ono, for example, had the ruler of the 7th and the 12th and experienced her husband getting shot, the loss of a husband, for example.
Yeah.
Or various other challenging configurations that you could have, the ruler of the 5th in the 12th, or
absolutely loss of child.
It is generally unfortunate. Like the 6, 12, and to a fair degree 8th. Like if there is whatever planet is there, whatever houses it rules will tend to suffer.
Yes.
And I think that disappearance, like loss as like, because we can have misfortune in terms of something turning bad but still existing. I would agree that the 12th is specifically is specifically associated with dissipation or evaporation,
vanishing.
Like they're not there, and that's I think that ties in very well with the isolation, because if you're isolated, it's because people aren't around.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. It's not because
they're all vaporized.
Right. It's not
literally.
Yeah.
But it's like the vapors.
Right, but they're not part of your world.
No.
Right.
No, and that's where I think the 12th is about being away from, like when it gets triggered by timing factors, it's you are away from the normal things, the people or places that are in your world.
Sure.
For a temporary period of time.
And there's definitely ways that can work out positively, or if you have mitigations going on, like if planets in the 12th are sextile or aspecting the degree of the midheaven within 3 degrees, that can mitigate it, and you can see more constructive manifestations of the 12th house.
I have a funny example for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I knew a shady real estate person maybe 10 years ago who had a Venus-Jupiter conjunction in the 12th, exactly sextile the midheaven. And like they made a lot of money. It was pretty shady, but
they did it.
They made it work for them in their career by doing shady stuff.
It was favorable for this person.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I always think of the 12th house as the writing cave for me personally, in the sense, from how has the 12th house productive? If you do have to get a project done, for instance, being productive in private or in seclusion can be, helpful in that regard. So there are things that you can do when you are disconnected from the normal stuff.
Yeah, when I was in my last 12th house perfection year, right at the beginning of the year, I lost my sister. She passed away, and I moved back home out to the middle of nowhere in this tiny town in Colorado to support my mom at the time, and just ended up spending that 12 months in the middle of nowhere. And I immediately set myself to trying to write my book and do all of the research. And I spent most of the year writing in isolation for the most part that year.
While you were in a 12th house perfection. Yeah. But that's where you can do productive things from the 12th house.
Well,
space.
So a few other things. One, when there are reasonable mitigations, you are like sometimes like ruler of the 10th and the 12th with some other helpful stuff. You'll see people who are very effective behind the scenes.
Yes.
I've seen that a lot. And then also some people have associated magic or occultism with the 12th, which I think is an error. Spiritual things can happen there, like you can get cursed, according to Lily, right? But in that we're wrestling with the kakodaimon or the bad spirit in the 12th. That is fourth from the ninth. It is like the supportive foundation of your quest for truth or any sort of ninth house capacity for divination or magic or, clear thinking or publishing. Did you solve the fourth house thing?
Yes. That's how you can do the ninth house thing.
That's a fourth root to the ninth.
Yeah.
That's a secondary thing, but it comes up.
Have we talked about like sickness or illness? Because this is part of the axis of the 6th and 12th house. And while there's certainly a tendency for the 6th house to be more like physical ailments and illness, and the 12th house to be more mental, or that might be where you might look if you're looking for mental disturbance or illness, there's also sometimes still can be
a physical.
Yeah, like physical illness and sickness components to the 12th house.
Well, and it's very rare to find a physical illness that does not cause mental suffering. It's very difficult to find a significant mental illness that does not
have a physical
cause the body to decline.
Yeah, there's one of the food bloggers that I follow suffers from a condition known as ulcerative colitis. And
that's rough.
It's really rough. And she's been, I guess, in remission for a number of years, and she's been publishing books and having her family and, really living a very full life. But she's had a really bad flare recently, and she's been in hospital for the last couple of weeks away from her family. She's been on isolation because her immune system is completely shot. So her 3 young children haven't been able to come visit her. And she is in a 12th house environment. She's isolated in hospital, but because of a physical problem.
Sure.
So that's just one very current example of the links that you were talking about, Austin.
Right, just like 1, 7, 6, 12 is it's a hell of an axis.
It's tight. So the trigger is the physical problem, but she's got a public profile, so she's shared stuff, via the gram about how hard she's finding it, and I think she's seen her kids like twice in the last 2.5 weeks or something.
Right.
It's very, very distressing, and one of her children's only a couple of years old, so
okay.
Yeah.
So you get some of the like isolation stuff as well.
Total isolation.
Sure.
Yeah. I think the sickness and the suffering, while we probably do tend to prioritize the mental component in the 12th, they are connected. You can still be suffering in the 12th from a physical problem.
Yeah, because it's a house that's declining and detracting from the first, and the first is not just the mental, but also the physical.
Body. Yeah.
So that which detracts from the first, or the falling away or a wasting away of the first, is part of what the 12th signifies, and it can be both mind as well as body.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. What else? So one last thing conceptually there is that this has brought up something we could do to round this out, which is that last point brought back something that goes back to the very beginning of the tradition, which is just the interconnectedness between opposing houses and the interrelationship between houses that are opposite to each other. So there's a lot of different interrelations. We've talked about angular triads and like the sequence of 3 houses grouped around the angles. And we've got sometimes pairs of houses that are very closely paired together next to each other, like the 5th house, the place of good fortune, next to the 6th house, the place of bad fortune, or the 11th house, the place of good spirit, next to the 12th house, the place of bad spirit. But then we've also got this polarity and this interlinking and relationship between the significations of opposing houses that's so crucial and important, and is probably another key to understanding the significations of any one house, is also looking at and opposing it to the significations of the opposite house.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so on a practical level, if there are like rough oppositions in the sky and they're in 612, it's not going to be a physical or a mental, like there will be suffering at multiple levels of being.
Unfortunately, both. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you just know, like, if that axis gets pinged hard, like, that's bad news. And it's not one or the other.
Well, in the same way that if the 5th, 11th axis gets pinged, this is generally going to be positive.
Yeah.
And it can be positive in more than one way. So I'm hoping that between, like, this episode and the first episode, people are really starting to see some of those connections between the pairs of the houses and how they're, like, opposing topically, but complementary or still interconnected
Yeah.
in terms of the theme.
Yeah.
And it creates also, though, sometimes a frustrating ambiguity because they can exchange significations, and you can see the same significations in both houses. And while sometimes we want to like create very strict distinctions between the two, sometimes they can share significations in weird ways.
Yeah. Well, does that mean we also need to talk about large animals in the 12th house?
I don't know. I mean, we have pets in the 6th, which is a more modern one, although I think...
I don't know anybody with any large animals.
Horses.
Okay.
People sometimes... I've had a few charts over the years with people who are, into the horse culture or the horse sort of community, and...
That horse life.
I've never understood
got strong 12th house.
Because I think this shows up already in Rhetorius in the 7th century, and it starts by then of assigning like animals to 6 and 12, but I've never fully understood why. Like I can almost get that with the 6th, where you end up they're assigning like slaves to the 6th, and they also end up putting like pets to the 6th.
Or domesticated animals or something.
Yeah, but I've never understood otherwise symbolically.
Is it because a big animal can trample you?
I wonder about that.
Maybe.
Yeah. And also the lack of containment, like an elephant. Of course you can contain a horse, but they do still have that kind of wild...
You can... horse decides to kick you.
That's what I mean.
You can die.
Exactly. My grandfather lost an eye because of the horse.
My great-grandfather died after getting kicked by a horse.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's like a dog or a cat is less likely to kill you, although maybe they could through infection, like a bite. But yeah, the large animals...
Yeah, I've never dwelt on it very much because I just don't fully understand symbolically how they got there.
Yeah, I don't know that either, but I do know that occasionally I will see if somebody is really passionate about elephant conservation or large animal conservation.
Okay.
It's very weird, but it's like, oh, okay, this is where we get this 12th house little piece coming from.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just the large animals.
Yeah. Well, then, but
fuck the small animals.
Well, that's
if they were interested in the small animals, they'd have the 6th house.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which I have seen.
Yeah.
I haven't done a lot with that, but I have occasionally seen that 6th house thing.
Yeah.
I see pets. Yeah, I see pets in 6.
In the 6 for sure.
And they are totally your enemies. They are bad for your health.
They are often, yes.
At least cats are.
Cat litter, oh my God, yeah.
That actually brings up so there's an argument sometimes about whether to put pets with modern astrologers about whether to put them in the 6th, the 5th, to the extent that some people treat their children like their pets like their children. I don't know. We don't have to go into that, but
they're not your children.
The only thing I would say, I'm a loving pet parent, and my cats are very well treated, and I've talked about them so often on the podcast, but I still would insist that they are a 6th house part of my life and not a 5th.
Yeah, Kate will refer to me as the father of her cat.
Yeah, and I'll call them our
and
fur
that's
babies.
fun, but I don't actually think that I'm the father of the cat.
No,
right?
It's a genetic impossibility.
It's not like continuing your family lineage,
right? Like this cat is going to do me proud.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I can understand the love, and I guess that's what I'm trying to acknowledge is I totally get the love that you have for a pet,
right?
And that they get in your heart. We had
not everything you love is your child.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
But it's also tough
your
because
spouse
they do.
Is not your child, but you love them.
Yeah.
I mean, pets do become part of a person's family, and like
absolutely.
The loss or death of a pet can be like a major.
Yeah.
Thing. But it still does show up in the 6th house when I've seen it.
When I've done timing about people losing a pet, 99% of the time there's 6th house stuff going on. 6th, something in the 6th, a perfection 6, or something to the ruler of the 6th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One we completely skipped that I meant to do, I think, but we didn't, was we completely skipped over the discussion about the debate about sex in the 8th house and whether to put it there at all.
We talked about it in the 5th.
Right. Well, because that's where most traditional astrologers put it. But I just know there's a lot of modern astrologers and new students that are going to wonder, why didn't we talk about that at all with the 8th?
Oh, because it's in episode 1?
Did we?
Well, I thought we talked about it with the 5th.
We did.
Yeah, okay, so
we did pleasures of the body. Yeah.
That we traditionally, or at least from the medieval period onwards, sex tended to be associated with the 5th house and the joy of Venus.
Yeah.
Eventually in modern times, through assigning Scorpio to the 8th house and Pluto or whatever, they started assigning the eighth house to sex, but that was only in the past century or past few decades.
Yeah.
So now it's kind of a modern debate where some astrologers assign sex to the eighth and others, more traditionally inclined astrologers, tend to put it in the fifth.
Fifth, yeah. And I think you had also mentioned in the part 1 episode that there were some references to it in the 7th house.
Yeah, well, that's one of the funny things. When I see traditional astrologers, usually medieval astrologers, going like too hard against modern astrologers, I sometimes like to pull out like, well, that even in and of itself was only a thing that was happening from, let's say, like the 8th or 9th century until the 17th or 18th century. It was assigned to the 5th, whereas if you go back earlier, it was assigned to the 7th.
Yeah.
So it's like nobody necessarily has full authority to say, I don't know, it's definitely this house and you're an idiot if you assign this signification to this, because I think what's most important is just getting to the underlying symbolism and having a good reason conceptually and philosophically, as well as practically, to assign whatever signification you come up with. And different astrologers are going to adopt and endorse different conceptual models that they think make sense to them, and then use those to generate significations from the houses. And that's a real discussion that has to be had in the astrological community that's recent, because now there's so many different conceptual models that there's a real debate sometimes that come up and can be legitimately argued one way or another. But I think the important thing is just being deliberate about what model you're using and not necessarily taking things for granted, but instead knowing why you think certain things mean what they mean. And trying to have a good rationale or reason for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good.
Are you willing to be that charitable, Austin?
Sure.
Sure.
As long as you don't make him say more about it.
Why not?
Well, because
I just think that if I were going to put money on whether a person would have more sex, all other factors being equal, during a 7th or 8th house perfection, I would bet 7th or 5th very strongly over 8th.
See, the one reason I say that is because I've, in my my episode on this, whatever episode that was on the astrology podcast, I did throw out a bone to those who want to continue to try to argue the 8th from a different perspective, as I think you could try to do it from a traditional perspective by saying that the 8th house is the succedent house that follows after the 7th. And so therefore, theoretically or conceptually, following the exact same model some of the traditional astrologers did, the 8th should follow that which comes after the partnership that you form in the 7th. And one of the things that does follow after subsequently to getting in a long-term relationship or a marriage with somebody is like having sex as part of the relationship, let's say theoretically.
Yeah, I think that you can make a decent argument for the 8th as connected to sex, I would say in a secondary way, where it's the substance of the other.
Right.
But I don't think that makes it the primary house, because there's all this other 8th house stuff, which is not sexy.
Correct. Yeah.
Sure, but let's just say it could, because one of the things we need to, one of the discussions we have to have.
Actually, let me strengthen that point. One of the primary significations of the 5th house is good things happening to the physical body.
Yeah, I mean that has got to be the primary part.
One of the primary, another primary 5th is things that are pleasurable and fun, and specifically bodily, right?
Yeah.
And then with the 7th, like it's all about the intersection between you and another. And so the 8th is not primarily about other people's bodies. You can get there. It's not contrary to the house. But if you look at the 8th doesn't bring people together in happy union. You need something else besides just 8th houseness to bring bodies together in joyful, loving, pleasurable union. You don't have joyful, loving, pleasurable, fruitful as keywords for the 8th in the tradition at all.
Well, right. But the 8th is also that which is a value, is seen to be a value that the other has or possesses. And when you get into that as a broad second house thing, while we usually put possession in that, like, I don't know, you start getting into broader meanings where it could start heading in that direction.
Yeah, you can get there, but it's not it's not nearly as primary as it is for the 5th or 7th. I wouldn't
Yeah.
mind taking into account the 8th, but I would privilege the 5th and 7th above the 8th.
Sure. And that's fine. And I can get completely on board with that. I think one of the discussions I think we need to have as a community, though, at this point is when you go back and I read Valens, as I've done a few passages, one of the things you'll immediately see is they're often assigning a topic to multiple houses.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not this preoccupation that we've had, I think, that probably grew out of the horary tradition, which became, because horary wasn't really practiced that much, if at all, in the Hellenistic tradition. And then in the medieval tradition, it started being practiced. And then by the Renaissance, that's like the main thing that they're practicing. Lilly opens up by teaching horary, whereas all earlier authors opened up with like mundane or natal. And with horary, you kind of do need to try to have one primary
house.
significator, one primary house that rules a topic.
Yeah.
But in Hellenistic, we can see them having, like children, for example, they would say 5th house, but they would also say 10th house and 11th house and maybe even 4th house for children as well.
Yeah.
Or friends, we see Valens assigning to like several
3,
different
11.
houses.
There was like 3, like my friendships came up 3 or 4 times.
Right.
So I think the point, Chris, one of the larger points that I think you are making here is that ancient astrologers didn't all agree on specifically one house per topic type of thing.
Yeah, and it wasn't just that they didn't agree, but it was that they held that there was enough multivalence in different houses that sometimes you could have a certain topic that could be assigned to multiple houses, and that's okay.
It's okay if you know 5th, 7th. I mean,
yes, but a lot of those are like, children is a pretty big topic and sex is a big topic.
Yeah.
And it's like, what role do the houses, like each of the houses has a specific relationship to that topic. Mm-hmm. Like we talked about 5th and 7th, like those have those both have a relationship to sex. But they don't have the same relationship to sex.
No.
Like if we can't just, there is, I think a, finer differentiation implied, behind the assignment of this house will impact children. This other house will impact children, but sometimes we have to do a little thinking in terms of, okay, well, how does it impact
in
this
what way?
topic?
Yeah.
Right. And I know that like intellectually, I want to do that and I want to go there with you and come up with the differentiation so that we can say this house could be children in this way and this house could be this other side of children. But I think originally they were getting there not from that, but instead just from the fact that if you're trying to derive significations from symbolic interpretations of astronomical movements, that there were just different ways that you could end up with assigning certain topics to different houses. So to go back to children, we've talked about astronomically how the 5th house is the succedent house that follows after the 4th. And if we establish that the 4th house represents one's family and one's parents and one's lineage, then the 5th is that which follows after that. So therefore, your family lineage and its continuation, we can see how they perhaps, and this is just an argument that I've made about how children got assigned there, but then they also assign children to the 10th under the premise that the 10th is your praxis and is that which you do or that which you create, that which you make.
Mm-hmm. The enactment.
Right. And therefore,
your work in the world.
Your work in the world. For some people, like having children is one of the things that they accomplish or do or create in their life and is a significant thing in that way. And that's one of the ways how you can see how they would have gotten to children being, something that could also be assigned to the 10th house.
But do you have kids when you have 10th house transits, or is it when there's, when do people get pregnant? Like the theoretical is very important and the rationale is important, but we also have to, as practitioners, you have to look at what do these things do and take that into account. And there's a dialogue between, It's not that the entire system of astrology was created purely mentally before ever being tested out at all. Like, you don't think that they were like, okay, I'm pretty sure if we do it this way, the theoretical rational, we should get children here. And they didn't look at charts.
Yeah, but like some people absolutely do
forth.
have 10th house transits when they have children. Or I've seen some people in their zodiac releasing from a lot of spirit periods, which usually just represent a person's career. Like they'll go into peak periods when they had kids, or you'll see a loosing of the bond, and that was them having children, because for that individual, in some instances, not in all instances, them having kids is something that's tied into their overall career or life's work. And while that's not the same way for everybody, I do see that with some people or some clients.
That definitely happens with some charts.
Sure. So then that's, though, an independent, not just symbolic, but also practical reason why sometimes kids can be
but you
not
can
just
get
fifth house, but
indicators
also
of
10th.
children in any house if you have the ruler of the fifth. I don't know. I feel like we're pursuing this point perhaps too far.
Well, I just want to mention it because since one of the things that we did in this episode was to blend modern and traditional significations, and we've tried to be very specific and very deliberate about saying this house is assigned to this signification, this house is assigned to this signification, and we've kind of glossed over and not focused or dwelt too much on debates or differences between astrologers. We did run into a difference between like the two of us about whether enemies should be assigned to the 12th, but otherwise we've glossed over a lot. I just want to make sure that as we contribute this to the astrological community, that one of the things I want to do in discussions I think the community should have is about the question about whether you have to assign a topic to just one house, or can we have broader discussions about can a topic be assigned to multiple houses in the long term without ruining the consistency and the efficacy of the system.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that, like I said earlier, that multiple houses can contribute to some topics in different ways.
Right. Yeah. And I completely agree with that. And I think that's an important thing to think about, because I don't know that a ton of work has been done on that, because we tend to have more discussions about singularly assigning one house to topics instead of...
Yeah, I would say, and Kelly, tell me what you think, that comes up a lot in practice, where someone's like, yeah, I'm trying to do this. And then I will look for everything that's supportive of that and everything that can detract from that. And so I think that again, that comes up in practice inevitably.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, because, I mean, and I think there is that scope for sure, because you're looking for, okay, this planet could signify this topic. I could get it out of this house and maybe a little bit out of that house kind of thing.
Yeah,
because when your client wants to know about a topic, you want to make sure you give a really holistic or well-rounded response around that.
Or like Venus and relationship, or the topic of relationships, and looking into like Venus as a general significator, or looking into the 7th house, or looking into the ruler of the 7th house.
Yeah.
So that you're looking at like multiple things that are all giving sometimes the same recurring or echoing the same indication, or sometimes they're indicating different things depending on what significator you're looking at.
Yeah, they're all pieces of the puzzle around the same topic, if you like. So if we want to solve for relationships, we need to look at the ruler of the 7th, we need to look at what's in the 7th, and we need to look at Venus as a starting point. There's a couple other things you can sometimes bring in depending on what else is happening in the chart, but they're going to be your base beginning points.
Yeah.
If I'm looking at fertility, I'm looking at the 5th, the ruler of the 5th, the moon, and the 1st house ruler of the 1st, you know, and you're looking at 3 or 4 different things, but you're trying to get a whole picture. Are all of those things in good condition for fertility? Are they all in bad? Are some in good and some in bad? And you weigh your assessment accordingly.
Yeah. And that's where something like the modern, which is also a traditional concept, but the rule of 3 of if you see something come up once, then it's like a maybe. If you see it come up twice, it's more certain or probably. And if you see it come up 3 times in 3 different ways, then it's almost definite that the person's likely going to experience whatever that is symbolically that's being pointed to in the chart.
Yeah.
Well, and also, in terms of houses, I do a fair amount with derivative houses, and just like not just houses from houses, but also coding those in terms of whether that's supportive or not. Like, A planet in the 11th house is going to support a planet in the 7th because it's in an inferior trine to it, and the planet in the 7th is going to pull support from that.
Yeah.
It's not that the 7th or the 11th is inherently about one-on-one relationships, but in that chart, anything there is going to be in a position to support.
Yes.
Right? Which we can follows, right? If you're around a lot of people, it's going to be easier to find somebody.
To find a romantic partner.
The 12th is 6th from the 7th. If you are alone, and miserable, it's going to be harder.
Yes, to find a partner.
To find other people who are, want to join
your suffering
beings.
Yes.
But, and so, if in sort of outlining the task of the astrologer collectively as well as individually, sorting is, I think we've done a good job of trying to sort what are the primary effects of a given house, and then what are secondary, like important secondaries, and then we could, we've already spent 6 hours on this, right?
Yes.
So we didn't dig into the tertiaries too much, but those are there, right?
Yeah.
Tertiaries are like derived houses that you've mentioned, for example, like turning the chart and saying that that the 10th house is the 4th from the 7th, so it might indicate the parents of the marriage partner or whatever.
Right. Although some of the derived stuff is pretty strongly secondary, like the second from the 7th, we did a lot with that, and that's used all the time.
Yeah.
But I mean,
you can get crazy. It starts getting kind of ridiculous if you go too far with the derived houses, and there is a danger of that.
Right, like the spouses, brothers, children.
Yeah,
or which would be the 5th from the 3rd from the 7th.
Or like the pets of the spouse's children's brother or something like that.
Now
my
you're
uncle's
off the deep
cat.
end.
Right.
Yeah. And so if there's a specific question about that and you do that, it'll be useful.
Yes.
But you don't want to come into a natal chart where you're like, what's their uncle's cat going to be?
Yes, like? That's true, because you want to keep the energy clear, the information clear.
Well, and there's probably diminishing returns at some point if you
Absolutely, that's the better phrase.
Well, what is the value of knowing the fate of your uncle's cat?
Yes.
Yeah.
To what extent?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, guys. I think on that note,
on that crazy note,
I think we did it. I think we're done, and I think we need to wrap up this 2-part series on the significations of the 12 houses.
Yes.
So, congratulations, good job. Thank you for joining me for this today. I think this is a really good and important discussion, and I think it'll lay a nice foundation both for those that are new students as well as intermediate and advanced students that are trying to ground their understanding of this, which is, basically like 1/4 of our system of Western astrology, which is composed of planets, signs, aspects, and houses.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can get this quarter down, then you've got maybe 25% of the system down. Maybe that's a little, broadly speaking, or going too far, but it's a huge chunk.
Well, I would
it's
say
essential.
Once you get all 4, then it becomes operational.
Yeah.
Right.
Then you have a stable table.
Ooh.
I'm a poet, and I didn't even know it.
I like that.
But it is, the 4 makes things stable. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So obviously, even though we spent a long time doing this was just sort of a piece of sort of a treatment of the houses that we all got together and did sort of off the top of our head really quickly. If people, as we said in the previous episode, want to learn more, each of us has books and courses and classes and lectures and everything else where we go into even more depth on this specific topic. Kelly, what have you done on the houses if people want to study with you and learn more from your approach?
Yeah, I cover it in my Practical Astrology Beginners course, which is a 6-week training. And if you on my website, you're under the Learn Astrology tab, there's a button that says Newbies Start Here, because it is foundational. And then I've also got a webinar on the rulers of the houses, which is a really important topic too. And that's under the Learn Astrology online classes tab at kellysastrology.com.
Brilliant. Austin?
All right. So I have a series of lectures recorded on the houses that are purchasable, and the houses are an important unit in my year 1 astrology program.
Okay. What's your website?
At austincoppock.com.
Brilliant. And I wrote the book Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune, which has a chapter on the houses, as well as a chapter on house division and the origins of the different forms of house division. And I also have a 3-lecture series in the middle of my online course on Hellenistic Astrology, where I go through the 12 houses and how to interpret the ruler of the ascendant and the ruler of different houses in each house, and then finally how to interpret planetary condition within the context of the rulers of the houses, so that you can know whether the ruler of the house is working out well, and if it's favorably placed, or if it's poorly placed and not working out, how that will turn out, just by showing tons of example charts that I collected in my practice. So you can find out more information about that course at courses.theastrologyschool.com. All right, that's it for this episode of the Astrology Podcast. So thanks a lot for everybody who's listened or who has watched this episode on YouTube. Please be sure to subscribe, rate it on iTunes, give us a thumbs up on YouTube, sign up for Patreon to support the podcast if you want to see more episodes like this in the future. And otherwise, that's it. So we'll see you again next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks to the patrons and sponsors who helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through a page on patreon.com, including patrons Christine Stone and Nate Craddock, as well as the AstroGold Astrology app available at astrogold.io, the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs at honeycomb.co, and also the International Society for Astrological Research, which is hosting an astrology conference in Denver, Colorado, September 10th through the 14th, 2020. And you can find out more information about that at esar2020.org. And the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening in Seattle, May 21st through 25th, 2020. And you can find out more information about that at norwac.net. For more information about how to sign up to become a patron of the podcast, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast.